The wedding was 11 days away. Diana Spencer was at Buckingham Palace, going through the final preparations that the weeks before a royal wedding organized themselves around. The fittings, the rehearsals, the endless ceremonial requirements of an occasion that 700 million people were going to watch. She was 20 years old. She had been engaged for 5 months. She had moved into Buckingham Palace for the pre-wedding period, alone in the specific way that the palace's size and formality made aloneness possible, even in a building full of staff. Navigating the institutional world she was about to formally enter with the combination of genuine excitement and genuine anxiety that the circumstances would produce in anyone, let alone a 20-year-old whose previous experience of institutional life was a Swiss finishing school and a London nursery job. She found the bracelet in Charles's possession. The specific circumstances of the discovery, exactly where she found it, whether she found it herself or was told about it by someone who had found it, are described with slight variations across the various accounts of the period that have addressed the episode. What is consistent across those accounts is the essential fact. Diana discovered, in the days before her wedding, that Charles had commissioned a piece of jewelry as a gift for another woman. The bracelet was engraved with 2 letters, G and F, Girl Friday, which was the private nickname Charles used for Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana understood immediately what the bracelet was and who it was for. She was 20 years old, and she had grown up in a social world where the relevant codes were the codes she had been formed in, and the codes were sufficient for the immediate and accurate decoding of what the object in front of her communicated. It communicated that the man she was about to marry had a private nickname for another woman. It communicated that the nickname was intimate enough to be the basis for a piece of engraved jewelry. It communicated that the jewelry was being prepared for delivery to the woman who had the nickname in the days immediately before the wedding that was supposed to be the formal conclusion of whatever had existed between Charles and that woman before Diana's arrival in his life. The bracelet communicated that the arrival had not concluded anything. This is the knowledge that Diana carried into St. Paul's Cathedral on July 29, 1981. Into the dress with the 25-foot train. Into the ceremony, watched by 700 million people. Into the marriage that the fairy tale narrative required her to enter as the woman who was beginning the most significant and most fortunate chapter of her life. She knew the chapter was beginning with a lie. Not a lie she had been told, exactly, because no one had told her anything directly about Charles and Camilla. The palace had managed the information about the relationship through the specific mechanism of simply not providing it, which is the form of institutional dishonesty that is most difficult to name and most impossible to address. She had not been lied to. She had simply not been told the truth, and the bracelet was the truth, finding her through the specific route that truths which are being managed find the people who are being managed away from them. What she did with the knowledge across the subsequent 15 years of her marriage was the most consequential response to a single discovered object in the modern history of the British royal family. The bracelet was the beginning of Diana's education in the specific institution she had entered and in the specific conditions of the marriage she had committed to. And the education was an education that the institution had never intended to provide, and that the provision of was eventually going to cost the institution more than any conceivable alternative to the management decisions that had made the provision necessary. The room froze when she placed the bracelet on the table. The room froze because the people in it knew what the bracelet was and what Diana's placing it on the table meant. It meant that the management of the information had failed. It meant that the 20-year-old woman who was 11 days from becoming the Princess of Wales had discovered the thing she had not been supposed to discover and was signaling, through the specific gesture of placing the object in the space between herself and the people who had known about it and said nothing, that the management was over. She was right. The management, in the specific form it had taken across the period of the engagement, was over. What replaced it was the 15-year marriage, whose history this account examines, and the examining of that history requires starting where the history starts, with the bracelet, and what Diana found, and what the finding meant, and what the frozen room was the beginning of. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The days before a royal wedding in 1981, were days of extraordinary institutional intensity. The machinery of a ceremony organized to the scale of a state occasion, St. Paul's Cathedral, 700 million television viewers, the specific logistical requirements of a public event whose management involved every level of the palace's operational infrastructure, consumed the attention and the energy of everyone connected to it. For the participants at the ceremony's center, the intensity was the intensity of being the focal point of that machinery, while simultaneously being the people whose personal experience of the occasion was the experience the machinery was designed to produce. Diana Spencer had been living at Buckingham Palace in the weeks before the wedding. The move into the palace during the pre-wedding period was standard practice for royal brides of the era, the institutional logic being that the palace's physical proximity to the ceremonial requirements made the management of the final preparations more efficient if the central participant was on the premises rather than traveling from a separate residence. The logic was sound from the institutional perspective. The human experience it produced was the experience of a 20-year-old woman living alone in an enormous institutional building, surrounded by staff whose primary loyalty was to the institution rather than to her, navigating the final weeks of her previous life in conditions that were organized around the management of the event rather than around the management of her experience of it. She was alone in a specific way that people who have not experienced the particular loneliness of large institutional buildings cannot fully imagine. The palace was full of people. The people were present, efficient, professionally warm, in the register that professional warmth in that institutional context takes. None of them were her people. None of them were the friends, the family members, the intimates whose presence would have provided the specific human warmth that the pre-wedding period of extraordinary institutional intensity required, and that the palace's professional warmth consistently failed to provide. Charles was not consistently present. The accounts of the pre-wedding weeks from the people closest to the situation describe a dynamic that the official account of the engagement and the wedding has always managed into the background of the fairy tale narrative. The specific quality of Charles's engagement with Diana in the final weeks before the wedding, which was the engagement of a man managing his own complicated private reality alongside the institutional requirements of the occasion, rather than the engagement of a man in the full warmth of the relationship the occasion was supposed to be celebrating. The complicated private reality was Camilla Parker Bowles. The relationship between Charles and Camilla had not ended with the announcement of the engagement in February 1981. The people who were close enough to the relevant situation to have accurate knowledge of it understood that the announcement had formalized the institutional resolution of the succession's marital requirements, without resolving the personal reality that had existed alongside and beneath those requirements for the preceding decade. The announcement had said, "Charles is marrying Diana Spencer." It had not said, "Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles is over." The institutional management of the distinction between those two statements was the management that the palace had been conducting across the engagement period and that the bracelet's discovery was about to interrupt. Diana found the bracelet in Charles's possession. The precise mechanics of the discovery are described in slightly different terms across the different accounts that have addressed the episode. Some accounts suggest she saw it being prepared for delivery. Others suggest she came across it in circumstances whose exact specificity the people who have described them have been careful to leave imprecise. What is consistent across the independent accounts is the essential fact of the discovery itself and the specific nature of what was discovered. The bracelet was a gold chain bracelet. Charles had commissioned it from his jeweler. It was engraved with a blue enamel disc bearing the letters G and F, initials whose meaning Diana decoded immediately upon understanding what she was looking at. G and F for Girl Friday, which was the private nickname that Charles used for Camilla Parker Bowles in the specific register of their private relationship, the register of the intimate nickname that signals a relationship whose quality goes beyond the formal and the social into the genuinely personal. The decoding was instant. Diana was 20 years old, but she was not naive in the specific sense of being unequipped to read the social codes of the world she had grown up in. And the world she had grown up in was a world whose codes were the codes in which such objects and such engravings communicated with complete clarity. A piece of jewelry, a private nickname, a commission timed to the days before the wedding. Each element was individually legible. Together they were unmistakable. What they communicated was this: the man she was about to marry had a relationship with another woman whose intimacy was sufficient to produce the private nickname that the engraving documented, and he was marking the formalization of his public commitment to Diana by sending that woman a private token whose specific language declared that the public commitment was not the whole story. The not the whole story was the truth that the institution had been managing away from Diana across the 5 months of the engagement. The management had been effective in the specific sense that Diana had not been provided with direct information about the Charles and Camilla relationship during the engagement period. The palace's management of the relevant information had prevented any direct disclosure of the kind that would have required a direct response. The management had been ineffective in the sense that management of information through non-disclosure is always vulnerable to the discovery of the information through routes the management did not anticipate and could not control, and the bracelet was a route the management had not anticipated and could not control. She confronted Charles about the bracelet. The accounts of what happened in the confrontation describe a conversation that the people who have described it characterize with a consistent quality, the quality of a young woman whose discovery had given her information, whose implications she was still processing, confronting a man whose management of the situation had not included preparation for this specific confrontation, in the specific institutional environment of the palace, where every conversation of significance was conducted within the awareness of the institutional context that surrounded it. Charles confirmed the bracelet was for Camilla. The confirmation was the confirmation of a man who had been discovered in a situation that the specific quality of the discovery made denial counterproductive. He had not told Diana about the bracelet or about Camilla in the explicit terms that the honest preparation of a bride for the marriage she was entering would have required, and the reasons for the non-telling were the reasons that this account will examine across its subsequent sections. But the confronted confirmation was at least the honest acknowledgement of what the discovered object was and who it was for, and the acknowledgement was itself a form of information that the engagement period's management had not previously provided. Diana was devastated. The accounts of her emotional state in the period immediately following the discovery are accounts of someone for whom the devastation was real and acute, and not managed into a more contained response by the specific emotional resilience that prior experience with institutional management of personal realities sometimes produces in the people who have developed it. Diana had not developed it. She was 20 years old, and she had grown up in a world where the specific codes of the relevant social world had governed how such things were managed, and the codes had not included preparation for discovering, 11 days before your wedding, that the man you were marrying had a private nickname for another woman that he was immortalizing in gold and enamel. The question that the discovery immediately produced was the question that Diana's accounts of the period returned to most consistently. What was she supposed to do with what she had discovered? The options available to a 20-year-old woman 11 days before the wedding of the century, with the institutional machinery of a global spectacle already fully deployed around her, with the dress made and the cathedral booked, and the 700 million viewers already committed to their television sets, with the family expectations and the public excitement and the specific institutional requirement that the occasion produce its required outcome already at the point of irreversibility, were not the options that the honest assessment of what the discovery communicated would naturally produce. The honest assessment communicated that the marriage she was 11 days from entering was being entered on false premises, that the man she was marrying had an existing intimate relationship with another woman that the institutional management of the engagement had not disclosed, and that the discovered bracelet had inadvertently made undeniable. The honest assessment, applied without the constraint of the institutional requirements and the irreversibility of the preparations, might have produced the conclusion that the information warranted a pause, a direct conversation about what the bracelet meant, what the relationship with Camilla was and would be after the wedding, what the basis of the marriage she was entering actually was. The direct conversation was not available to Diana in the conditions of the 11 days before the wedding. The conditions were the conditions of an irreversible institutional momentum that had acquired, across the 5 months of the engagement period, the specific quality of an event that the institutional world had committed to producing, and that the withdrawal of the central participant would have interrupted with consequences whose scale was genuinely beyond what any individual consideration, even a consideration as fundamental as the honest basis of the marriage being entered, could straightforwardly override. Diana's sister Jane, to whom she went in the immediate aftermath of the discovery, was among the people whose accounts of the conversation described the specific quality of the available options at that point. Jane's response, as Diana subsequently described it, was the response of someone who understood the institutional irreversibility and who communicated it with the directness of a sibling rather than with the diplomatic management of an institutional official. "The dress was made," she said. "There was no going back." The response was accurate. There was no going back. The dress was made, and the cathedral was booked, and the 700 million viewers were already committed, and the institutional momentum of the occasion was irreversible in the specific sense that the only available alternatives to proceeding were alternatives whose costs were genuinely beyond what the 20-year-old standing in Buckingham Palace could realistically choose to pay. She proceeded. She proceeded carrying the specific knowledge that the bracelet had given her, and she proceeded with the combination of genuine feeling for Charles, which was real, and which the accounts of people close to Diana across the engagement period consistently identify as genuine rather than performed, and the specific knowledge that the genuine feeling was not the whole story of the marriage she was entering. The not the whole story was the thing that nobody had told her. The institution had managed it away from her across 5 months of the engagement period. The bracelet had delivered it in the specific circumstances of the 11 days before the wedding, in conditions where the delivery was too late to alter the institutional momentum, but early enough to ensure that she walked into the ceremony carrying something she was going to carry for 15 years. She walked into St. Paul's Cathedral on July 29, 1981, with the knowledge of the bracelet. She walked down the aisle with it. She stood at the altar with it. She said the vows with it. She rode in the carriage back to Buckingham Palace with it. She appeared on the balcony with it, the image that became the defining image of a fairy tale beginning, the kiss that the cameras caught, and that every newspaper in the world ran on its front page the following morning. The knowledge was there in every moment of the day. It was there in the specific quality of the beginning, the awareness of the gap between the story that the day was producing for 700 million people and the private reality that the bracelet had communicated to the one person most centrally located in the story's construction. The gap was the gap that the subsequent 15 years of the marriage documented with the accumulating specificity of a marriage whose public account and private reality were organized around different facts. The public account was the account of the devoted couple, the Princess of Wales and the heir to the throne, the fairy tale that the wedding had produced and that the institutional management of the marriage's account was organized around maintaining. The private reality began with the bracelet. It was organized from the beginning around the knowledge the bracelet had provided, the knowledge that the public account was not the whole account, that the marriage had been entered on the basis of a managed information environment, rather than on the basis of the honest disclosure that the commitment the ceremony represented should have been founded on. Diana had not been told, she had found out. The finding out was the specific quality of the beginning that shaped every dimension of the 15 years that followed it. The shape was the shape of someone who knew they had been managed from the start, and who was going to spend the subsequent years of the marriage learning to manage back, learning the specific capabilities that the institutional environment she was inside required for effective navigation, learning them through the specific education that the bracelet had begun on that day in Buckingham Palace, when the discovery had given her the first lesson in what the marriage was actually going to be. The first lesson was the hardest. It was the lesson about the gap, about the distance between what the institution said the marriage was and what the private reality communicated about what the marriage actually was. The gap was the gap that every subsequent lesson in the education would be organized around, and the education would be a long one, and the lessons would accumulate across 15 years into the specific capability that the Panorama interview demonstrated and that the Morton book produced, and that the institutional management had spent the full length of the marriage trying to prevent Diana from developing. The bracelet was the beginning. The 20-year-old woman who found it walked into a cathedral 11 days later carrying it. The cathedral was full of people who did not know what she was carrying. The 700 million people watching on television did not know what she was carrying. The room that would freeze when she placed the object on the table did not yet know what was coming. The marriage had not yet begun. The bracelet had already determined a great deal about what the marriage was going to be. Camilla Rosemary Shand was born on July 17, 1947, in London, the eldest child of Major Bruce Shand and Rosalind Cubitt. The family she came from was the family of the English upper class in its specific post-war configuration, comfortable, landed in the way that the relevant class was landed, connected to the right institutions through the right relationships, possessed of the specific combination of social confidence and practical capability that the relevant formation produced in its daughters when the formation worked as it was designed to work. She was not a great beauty in the specific photogenic sense that the public roles available to women in her social world in the 1960s and 1970s tended to reward. The photographs from her 20s document someone attractive in the warm, physically comfortable way of people who are at ease in their bodies and in their social environments, without the specific quality of photogenic strikingness that Diana Spencer would bring to the royal world a decade later, and that the cameras would find irresistible in ways they never found Camilla. The comparison is inescapable, and it is worth making explicitly early in this account, because the comparison between the two women organized so much of the public reception of the Charles and Camilla relationship across the relevant decades, that treating it as simply a cultural backdrop misses its specific significance for understanding what the relationship was and why the institutional management of it took the form it took. Camilla's quality was not the quality of the camera, it was the quality of the room. The people who knew her in the relevant period, who were in rooms with her, who talked with her, who experienced her company across the specific occasions of the social world they shared, described someone whose primary quality was a specific kind of social intelligence, combined with a genuine warmth that the intelligence served rather than replaced. She was funny, not the performed humor of someone who has learned to be funny in social settings, because humor is a useful social tool, but the genuine humor of someone who found the world around her genuinely amusing and who expressed that finding with the directness and the specific timing that genuine humor requires. She was direct in the specific way that people who have been formed in the relevant social world and who are genuinely confident within it are direct, not aggressive, not deliberately challenging, but organized around the honest expression of her actual assessment, rather than around the managed performance of the assessment that the social occasion required. The directness was the quality that people who encountered her without prior expectation found most immediately notable. She said what she thought. She engaged with the person in front of her as the person actually was, rather than as the social occasion required them to be. And the engagement was the engagement of someone who was genuinely interested in the person, rather than in the management of the interaction. Charles met her in 1970 at a polo match. He was 21, she was 22. The meeting produced the connection that the subsequent 50 years of their history documented, the specific connection of two people who found in each other the particular combination of ease and genuine interest and shared humor that makes a specific relationship feel different from the other relationships available in the same social world. The connection was real from the beginning, and its reality was what made the subsequent institutional management of it so consistently difficult, because genuine connections are not amenable to the management tools designed for situations where the connection is less real or less sustained. By 1981, when Charles was commissioning the bracelet, their history had accumulated across 11 years of the specific social world they shared. The history included the period of the early relationship in the first half of the 1970s, when both were unmarried, and the connection was developing in the natural conditions that the social world they inhabited provided for such development. It included Camilla's marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles in July 1973, which had happened while Charles was on naval deployment, and which had closed the formal possibility of the relationship's progression toward the permanent commitment that the institutional requirements of Charles's position were always going to make complicated, regardless of the timing. The Parker-Bowles marriage requires examination here because it is the element of Camilla's situation in 1981 that the standard accounts tend to treat most briefly, as if the existence of her marriage was simply a biographical fact, rather than an active dimension of the situation the bracelet was commissioned within. Camilla, married Andrew Parker Bowles, and the marriage was a real marriage. It produced children, it organized a household, it placed Camilla within the specific domestic and social structure that the relevant world expected of women, of her background and formation, at the relevant age. The marriage was not a fiction or a placeholder. It was the institution of a shared life with a specific man, and the shared life had the specific reality that shared lives produce when both parties are genuine in their commitment to the form of the arrangement. What the marriage was not, and what the bracelet communicated with the specific eloquence of a privately engraved object, was the end of the connection with Charles. The connection had continued alongside the Parker Bowles marriage in the specific way that genuine connections of sufficient depth continue when the formal circumstances of both parties' lives have been arranged around different commitments. The continuation was not conducted in the dramatic forms of a grand romantic passion defying all obstacles. It was conducted in the specific quiet forms available within the social world they shared, the occasions where both were present, the specific quality of the connection's maintenance through the sustained contact that the shared social world provided, the particular understanding between two people who had found something real in each other and who were managing the maintenance of that real thing within the formal structures of their respective lives. The social world they shared was the world of the English upper class in its specific polo and country house configuration. The world whose code of discretion provided, as this account and several others in this series have discussed, the specific framework within which close personal relationships, alongside primary marriages, were managed and understood by the people inside the relevant world. The framework was the framework that made the maintenance of the connection possible across the years of the Parker Bowles marriage and across the years of the engagement and the early period of the Wales marriage. The people who were inside the relevant world and who had accurate knowledge of the connection's maintenance knew about it in the specific way that people know about things in small, socially cohesive worlds, through the accumulated evidence of observation and the specific social intelligence that the relevant world developed in its members across their formation within it. Andrew Parker Bowles knew, in the sense that the available evidence most consistently supports, the sense of someone who understood what the connection was and who managed his response to it within the framework that the relevant social world provided for exactly this kind of management. Camilla's specific position in 1981, married to Andrew Parker Bowles, maintaining the connection with Charles, receiving the bracelet in the days before Charles's wedding, was the position of someone who was inside multiple simultaneously operative commitments and who was managing her position within all of them with the specific competence that the relevant world's framework made available for such management. The management was not comfortable in the simple sense of being without difficulty or without cost. It was the management of a complicated situation by someone whose intelligence and whose practical capability were sufficient for the management that the situation required. The bracelet was Charles's communication to Camilla in the days before the wedding. The communication was organized around the private language of the relationship, the nickname, the enamel, the gold, and it communicated in that private language the specific message that the public occasion of the wedding was not the end of the private relationship. The wedding was the institutional resolution of the succession's requirements. The bracelet was the private statement that the institutional resolution was not the whole statement, that the private reality was being maintained alongside the public commitment in the specific form that the private relationship's history and its private language made available for the statement. Camilla received the bracelet. The receiving was the receiving of someone who understood what it communicated and what it meant, and what the communication and the meaning required of her in the conditions of the specific moment it was received. The conditions were the conditions of the most publicly visible wedding in the modern world's history, organized around the commitment of the man sending the bracelet to a woman who was not Camilla, and the meaning of the bracelet in those conditions was the meaning that the private language was designed to carry. It carried the meaning, I am doing what the institution requires. The private thing is still the private thing. Camilla understood the distinction between the public commitment and the private reality better than Diana did in July 1981, because Camilla had been inside the relevant situation long enough to have a full picture of its specific dimensions that Diana had not been provided with. She understood that Charles was marrying Diana because the institutional requirements of his position made the marriage necessary, and because Diana met those requirements in the specific ways that the institutional assessment of the available candidates had identified as optimal. She understood that the marriage and the private connection were, in the framework that both she and Charles were operating within, simultaneously operative realities, that the relevant world's framework was designed to accommodate alongside each other, rather than in competition with each other. She understood all of this. Diana understood none of it, because Diana had not been inside the relevant situation long enough, and had not been provided with the relevant information, and had grown up in the parts of the relevant social world that were adjacent to the aristocratic and polo world-specific framework, without being fully inside the framework's most specific cultural provisions. The gap in understanding between the two women in July 1981 was the gap that the subsequent 15 years of the Wales marriage was organized around. Camilla understood the framework and operated within it. Diana discovered the framework through the bracelet and spent the subsequent 15 years of her marriage in the specific process of deciding what to do with what she had discovered and what the discovered reality meant for the conduct of the marriage she was inside. What Camilla was in July 1981 was the woman who had known Charles across 11 years of genuine connection, who had managed that connection alongside the formal structures of both their lives, with the specific competence of someone formed in the relevant world and fluent in its specific framework, and who received the bracelet as the private communication of a man who was publicly committing to another woman and who was using the private language of their shared history to communicate to the woman who shared that history that the public commitment was not the full statement of where things stood. What Diana was in July 1981 was the woman who found the bracelet and decoded it in the 11 days before the wedding and carried the decoded knowledge into the ceremony and down the aisle and onto the balcony and into the marriage that was beginning. The two women had never met in any significant sense at the point of the bracelet's discovery. They would meet later, in the specific circumstances that the marriage's development would produce, and the meeting would be the specific confrontation that Part 6 of this account examines. But the dynamic between them was established by the bracelet before they had exchanged a significant word, because the bracelet was the communication that established the specific terms on which the marriage was being entered, and the specific terms on which Camilla's relationship with Charles would continue to operate alongside it. The terms were the terms of the relevant world's framework. Diana had not been told the terms. The bracelet had told her. The telling was 11 days before the wedding. The knowledge it produced was the knowledge she was going to carry for 15 years. Camilla was the woman who had received the object that communicated the terms. She had been inside the terms for 11 years before the bracelet was commissioned. She would be inside them for the full span of the marriage's duration and beyond. The understanding she had that Diana lacked was the understanding of someone for whom the terms were simply the conditions of the situation, absorbed across 11 years of operating within them, rather than the discovery of a 20-year-old woman who had been managed away from the terms until the object that communicated them found her in the specific circumstances of the 11 days before a wedding, that the discovery was too late to stop. The discovery was too late to stop the wedding. It was not too late to determine the quality of everything the wedding began. July 29, 1981, arrived with the specific quality that London produces on significant public occasions, when the weather cooperates and the city organizes itself around a collective experience of something that feels, in the moment of its happening, genuinely worth organizing around. The crowds had been gathering along the processional route since the previous evening. By the morning they were 600,000 deep along the streets between Buckingham Palace and St. Paul's Cathedral, and the atmosphere they produced was the atmosphere of people who had decided that this specific occasion was worth the overnight wait on a London pavement in July, which is to say, people who had arrived already committed to the experience the occasion was supposed to provide. The experience was the fairy tale. The fairy tale had specific requirements. It required the dress, which Emmanuel had been constructing across months of the most elaborate secrecy that a garment's construction had ever required, and which was revealed to the world when Diana stepped out of the glass coach at St. Paul's Cathedral. The ivory silk taffeta, the 25-foot train, the 10,000 mother-of-pearl sequins, the specific theatrical scale of an object designed to be seen from the street and from the air and from the seats of a cathedral and through the cameras of every television network in the world simultaneously. The dress met the requirement. It was exactly the dress the fairy tale needed. It required the groom. Charles arrived at the cathedral in his naval ceremonial uniform, with his brothers and his family, and the institutional weight of the monarchy organized around the specific public function he was performing. He was 32 years old. He was performing the function with the professional competence that the relevant institutional formation produced in the people it shaped for public occasions, which is to say, he was performing it effectively in all the visible dimensions and managing the private dimensions with the specific internal management that the visible performance required. The private dimensions were the bracelet and what the bracelet represented, now dispatched. They were Camilla, who was in the cathedral, seated in the congregation as a guest, present in the public occasion in the specific way that the relevant world's management of such situations made available, visible to anyone who knew where to look, and invisible to the public narrative of the occasion that the cameras were constructing for the 700 million viewers who were watching. The procession from Buckingham Palace to St. Paul's Cathedral was the procession of a woman carrying knowledge in an ivory silk taffeta dress with a 25-foot train. The glass coach moved through the 600,000 people who had stayed overnight on London pavements to see it, and the people responded to what they saw with the specific enthusiasm of people who had committed to the experience and who were receiving it in the form they had anticipated. The crowds cheered. The cameras captured the cheering. The television networks broadcast the capturing of the cheering to the 700 million people who were watching in their own countries, their own languages, their own domestic contexts, organized around the specific shared global experience that the occasion had become. Diana saw the crowds and responded to them in the specific way that her character, the warmth, the genuine quality of her engagement with the people in front of her, the particular responsiveness to human attention that was one of her most consistent qualities, produced in response to the sight of 600,000 people who had come to see her. The response was genuine. The crowds were genuinely moving to her. The scale of the public investment in the occasion she was at the center of was genuinely affecting to a 20-year-old woman who had grown up in a world where public occasions were things that happened to other people, and the genuine affect was visible in her face, through the glass coach windows, and in the footage that the cameras captured as it moved through the crowds. The genuine affect and the carried knowledge coexisted in the same person, in the same glass coach, moving through the same crowds. This is the specific quality of the wedding day that the official account of it has always managed into the background of the fairy tale narrative. The coexistence of the genuine and the managed, of the real experience of a young woman moved by the public's investment in her occasion, and the simultaneously present knowledge that the occasion she was being moved by was being constructed on a foundation that the public's investment in it had not been provided with the full information about. She arrived at the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral. The train was arranged by the Emmanuel team behind her, a process that required the specific attention to the specific fabric that a 25-foot train in ivory silk taffeta requires, and the arrangement was managed with the efficiency of people who had rehearsed it. The photographers captured the arrangement. The footage runs in the documentaries about the wedding that continue to be produced and broadcast at regular intervals in the decades since it happened, and in the footage, the arrangement of the train is one of the most replayed moments of the day. The specific visual that the fairy tale required, the dress doing exactly what the dress was designed to do. She walked into the cathedral on her father's arm. Johnny Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer, was 57 years old and had suffered a near-fatal brain hemorrhage in 1978, from which he had made a partial recovery that left him with specific residual physical effects. The walking down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral on his daughter's arm on July 29, 1981, was a public act of paternal love and paternal pride, performed in conditions where the performance required the specific physical management of the residual effects of a serious illness, and the people watching the processional were watching a man doing something that cost him something real in the service of the occasion's requirements. Diana walked beside him with the specific combination of visible emotion and managed composure that the occasion required and that her character produced in conditions of genuine emotional complexity. The cathedral was full of 2,500 guests. The organ was playing. The television cameras were positioned at the specific angles that the cathedral's architecture and the occasion's requirements had organized them at. The 700 million people watching in their domestic contexts around the world were watching the processional with the attention of people who understood they were watching something that would be watched again across the decades. The knowledge was there through all of it. The bracelet's communication, decoded 11 days earlier in Buckingham Palace, was present in the specific way that knowledge you cannot unknow is present, not as the foreground of the experience, not as the thing occupying the primary attention in the moments when the primary attention was required by the magnitude of the occasion around her, but as the permanent background against which the occasion's foreground was playing out. The vows were the most acute moment of the permanent background's presence against the foreground's requirements. The specific words of the marriage ceremony, the commitment to forsaking all others, the specific language of the exclusive and permanent commitment that the marriage ceremony is organized around, were words that the knowledge of the bracelet gave a specific additional dimension for the person saying them, in full possession of that knowledge. The words were said in the foreground, the knowledge was present in the background. The gap between the words and the knowledge was the gap that the institutional management of the information environment had created, and the gap was most acutely present at the specific moment when the words were requiring the person saying them to commit to a reality whose private dimensions had already communicated something different about what the reality actually was. Diana said the vows. She said them with the specific quality that every account of the ceremony, from people who observed it directly and from the footage that the cameras captured, consistently identifies. The quality of someone who was genuinely present in the moment of the commitment, moved by the weight of what she was committing to, aware of the specific magnitude of the occasion she was at the center of. The quality was real. The emotional reality of the ceremony for Diana was genuine in its specific dimensions. The cathedral, the music, the congregation, the public weight of the occasion, the genuine feeling she had for Charles, that the accounts of the engagement period consistently identify as real rather than performed. The genuine feeling and the knowledge existed simultaneously. The ceremony was the occasion on which both were most intensely present simultaneously, and the management of both simultaneously was the management of a 20-year-old woman on the most watched day of her life, doing the most significant thing she had done in her life, in conditions where the private reality of what she was doing was considerably more complicated than the public occasion acknowledged. Charles said the vows. His saying of them was the saying of a man who was also managing the specific complexity of the occasion's relationship to the private reality, the public commitment being made in the full presence of the private history that the bracelet had communicated to Diana, and that had been the organizing fact of the emotional landscape behind the public occasion's construction. The accounts of Charles's demeanor through the ceremony describe someone performing the required functions with the professional competence of a man trained across his entire life for exactly this category of public performance, and performing them in conditions whose private complexity the performance was required to manage without allowing the management to become visible. The ceremony concluded. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Runcie, pronounced them husband and wife. The register was signed. The recession from the altar to the west door of the cathedral was conducted. The glass coach returned through the cheering crowds to Buckingham Palace. The balcony appearance produced the kiss that the cameras captured, and that became the defining image of the day, the specific moment that the fairy tale required, and that the occasion had organized itself across months of preparation to produce. The photograph ran on the front page of every newspaper in the world the following morning. The image communicated the fairy tale with the complete effectiveness that the occasion had been organized to produce. The 700 million viewers had received the fairy tale in the form that the institution had invested the relevant resources in producing. The investment had produced the required return. Behind the image was the woman who had found the bracelet 11 days earlier. Behind the image was the knowledge the bracelet had communicated. Behind the image was the marriage that had just begun, in the specific conditions that the bracelet's discovery had established. The conditions of a public commitment made in full private knowledge of the private reality that the public commitment's account was not organized around acknowledging. The reception at Buckingham Palace was the reception of a wedding day, the specific social occasion that followed the ceremony, organized around the guests and the food, and the specific rituals of the relevant world's management of significant occasions. Diana and Charles were the center of it. They were the center of it, with the warmth and the visible happiness that the accounts of people who were present at the reception consistently describe, genuine in its specific moments, real in the quality of the interaction that the occasion produced between two people who were at the beginning of a shared life, and for whom the beginning, whatever the private complexity behind it, was the beginning. The private complexity was still there, the knowledge was still there, the marriage had not dissolved the knowledge by beginning. The beginning had simply added the weight of the commitment to the knowledge that had preceded it, and the combination of the commitment and the knowledge was the combination that the subsequent 15 years of the marriage were going to be organized around managing. The fairy tale was the public account. The knowledge was the private one. The gap between them was established on the wedding day itself, before the marriage had produced a single day of its own history, in the specific conditions of an occasion organized to produce the fairy tale account, and conducted in the full private presence of the knowledge that the fairy tale was not the full account. The wedding happened anyway, because the available alternatives to its happening were not real alternatives for the specific person in the specific conditions of the specific moment. Jane Spencer had told her sister the dress was made. She was right. The dress was made, and the cathedral was booked, and the 600,000 people were on the pavements, and the 700 million viewers were at their televisions. And the institutional momentum was the institutional momentum of an occasion that had acquired, across the 5 months of the engagement period, the irreversibility of something that the institution had committed to producing at a scale that the withdrawal of the central participant would have interrupted, with consequences genuinely beyond any individual consideration's capacity to override. The wedding happened anyway. The knowledge went with it into the marriage. The marriage began with the knowledge already inside it. What the marriage did with the knowledge across 15 years is the history of the Wales marriage, and the history begins with the day the knowledge arrived, and the day the knowledge was carried into the ceremony that formalized the marriage it was going to spend 15 years inhabiting. The fairy tale photograph ran on the front page of every newspaper. Behind the photograph was the woman who knew about the bracelet. The woman was smiling in the photograph. The smiling was real. The knowledge was also real. Both things were true on July 29, 1981, and both things would continue to be true across the 15 years of the marriage that the photograph was the beginning of. The honeymoon began on the royal yacht Britannia, sailing the Mediterranean across August 1981, and the accounts of it that have reached the public record through the various channels of private testimony describe an experience that was real in its specific difficulty, rather than manufactured in its unhappiness. The difficulty was not the dramatic difficulty of open conflict or explicit confrontation. It was the quieter, and in certain respects more damaging difficulty, of two people discovering, in the specific conditions of sustained intimate proximity that a honeymoon produces, the specific gap between what each had brought to the marriage and what the other had available to provide. Diana had brought the knowledge of the bracelet and the genuine feeling for Charles that had coexisted with the knowledge across the engagement period, and that the ceremony had not dissolved. The genuine feeling was real. The accounts of people who were closest to Diana in the early period of the marriage are consistent in describing someone who wanted the marriage to work in the specific sense of wanting the genuine connection with Charles that the feeling pointed toward, who had not entered the marriage as a strategic act without personal investment, who had arrived on the Britannia hoping that the shared life beginning on the yacht would develop into the marriage that the feeling required. The feeling required something that Charles, in the specific conditions of his formation and his private reality, was not consistently equipped to provide. The something was the sustained personal engagement of a man who was fully present in the marriage, not simply present in the institutional sense of performing the required functions of a married royal couple, but present in the specific intimate sense of being genuinely organized around the woman he had married and around the specific quality of her experience of the shared life they were beginning. Charles's formation had not produced that quality of sustained intimate presence as a reliable capability. The formation of the Windsor princes in the relevant era was a formation that had produced, in its most significant dimensions, men whose public performance was professional, and whose emotional availability in the private register was considerably more limited than the public performance implied. The specific emotional availability that Diana needed from Charles in the early years of the marriage was the availability that his formation had not developed in him, and that the specific private reality of his continued connection with Camilla Parker Bowles reduced further still. Because a man whose primary emotional connection is located outside the marriage he has just entered is a man whose emotional availability within the marriage is organized around what remains after the primary connection has been served. What remained was not nothing. Charles was not cold to Diana in the explicit sense of deliberate withdrawal or overt hostility. The accounts of the honeymoon and the early months of the marriage from people with knowledge of the situation describe a relationship that had genuine warmth in specific moments and genuine distance in others, organized around the specific pattern of availability and unavailability that the gap between what Diana needed and what Charles could provide produced across the days and weeks of the marriage's early period. The distance was what Diana experienced most consistently, and the experience of the distance was the experience of something she did not yet have the framework to fully understand in the terms that accurate understanding would have required. She understood that Charles was sometimes present and sometimes absent in the emotional sense. She understood that the warmth she received from him was intermittent in ways that the warmth she needed from him was not intermittent. She understood that the specific feeling of being genuinely known and genuinely attended to by the person who was supposed to be most organized around her was a feeling she was receiving in fragments rather than as the sustained condition of the shared life. What she did not yet fully understand in the early months of the marriage was the specific reason for the distance, the specific private reality that the bracelet had communicated the fact of, but whose full dimensions she was still in the process of discovering. The bracelet had told her that Camilla existed in Charles's private world in a specific intimate way. It had not told her the full history of what Camilla's existence in that world had been and continued to be, and the full history was what the years of the marriage would progressively and sometimes devastatingly reveal. Balmoral came after the Mediterranean honeymoon, the Scottish estate that the royal family organized the late summer around, with the specific rhythms of the Highland season, the shooting, the walking, the particular outdoor life that the Balmoral calendar had organized around the pleasures of the relevant people across the generations. The Balmoral period of the early marriage introduced Diana to the extended family context of the royal life in a sustained way that the pre-wedding occasions had provided only in glimpses. The Queen, Prince Philip, the family's specific domestic culture, the particular codes of the Balmoral world that had been developed across decades of use as the primary private space of the royal family's shared life. Diana found Balmoral difficult in ways that the accounts of the period are consistent about, and that the official account has consistently managed into the background of the fairy tale narrative's insistence on the early happiness of the marriage. The difficulty was not the difficulty of someone who found the outdoor life uncongenial or the Scottish climate insufficiently welcoming. It was the difficulty of someone who was discovering that the extended family context of the royal life was a context organized around its own established culture in ways that left insufficient room for the specific needs of a 20-year-old woman who had just entered it and who found the culture's specific codes and its specific emotional register consistently at odds with what she required from the daily environment of her life. The culture's emotional register was the register of managed composure, the specific quality of the Windsor family's approach to the expression of feeling that had been shaped across generations of public life in the most scrutinized institutional context available in the 20th century. The register was the register of people who had learned that the management of private feeling in service of the public performance was the required condition of their existence, and who had developed the specific emotional culture of a family whose primary requirement was the sustaining of the public performance regardless of the private reality. Diana's emotional register was different. It was the register of someone whose feeling expressed itself on the surface in the specific ways that genuine emotional transparency produces, visibly, immediately, in response to the specific texture of the daily experience, rather than managed into the composed distance that the Windsor culture required. The mismatch between the two registers was the mismatch that the Balmoral period of the early marriage made most visible, and the visibility was the visibility of someone whose way of being in the world was consistently at odds with the world she had entered. She was unhappy at Balmoral. The unhappiness was real. and it expressed itself in the specific ways that genuine unhappiness in institutional contexts expresses itself, through the physical symptoms that the body produces when the private reality is being managed out of the public account, through the specific quality of withdrawal from the social dimensions of the Balmoral life that the family noticed and did not know how to address, through the particular texture of someone who was experiencing the daily accumulation of evidence that the marriage she had entered was not the marriage she had hoped for, and who was not yet equipped to process the accumulation in terms that would allow her to understand what was happening and what to do about it. The eating disorder that Diana's own accounts of the period identify as beginning in the early weeks of the marriage was the specific physical expression of the psychological reality that the early months were producing in her. The accounts she gave across her adult life of the disorder's onset locate it in the specific conditions of the early marriage, the isolation, the distance from what she needed from Charles, the specific institutional environment of Balmoral with its emotional register so far from her own, the body expressing what the institutional context required to be unexpressed in any other form. Charles's response to the eating disorder and to the broader distress that the early months of the marriage were producing in Diana was the response that his formation and his situation equipped him to produce. The response of someone who understood that something was wrong, who was genuinely concerned about the welfare of the woman he had married, and who was not equipped with the specific capabilities that addressing the wrong in the terms it required would have demanded. The concern was genuine. The capability to act on the concern in the specific ways the situation required was limited by the formation that had produced the concern alongside the limitation, and the specific additional limitation of a man whose primary emotional connection was located outside the marriage, and whose availability for the sustained intimate engagement the situation demanded was reduced by the location of the primary connection. He arranged for the relevant medical people to be consulted. He managed the situation through the institutional channels available to him. He did not provide the specific thing the situation most required, which was the sustained, non-institutional, genuinely personal engagement of a man who was fully present in his marriage and genuinely organized around the welfare of the woman inside it with him. The first pregnancy arrived in the autumn of 1981, approximately 2 months after the wedding. The pregnancy was received by the institutional world with the specific relief of an institution whose primary concern with the Wales marriage had always been the production of the heirs that the succession required, and whose relief at the speed of the pregnancy's arrival reflected the institutional logic that the marriage had been contracted to serve. Diana was pregnant. The succession was being addressed. The institutional requirements were being met. Diana was 20 years old, newly married, discovering the distance between the marriage she had hoped for and the marriage she was inside, managing the early symptoms of an eating disorder, and pregnant. The pregnancy was wanted. She wanted children, and the wanting was genuine, and the specific joy that the pregnancy produced in her was genuine alongside the specific difficulty of the conditions under which it was beginning. But the pregnancy was also another element in the accumulation of the early months' education, another piece of evidence about the specific nature of the institutional life she was inside, and the specific priorities that the institutional life organized around itself. The education was the education that the Bracelet had begun, and that the early months of the marriage were continuing, with the accumulating evidence of daily experience. By the end of the first year of the marriage, Diana understood considerably more about the specific institution she had entered and the specific marriage she was inside than she had understood on the day she found the bracelet, and the understanding was darker and more specific than the knowledge the bracelet had provided on its own. The bracelet had told her that Camilla existed in Charles's private world. The first year of the marriage told her what Camilla's existence in that world meant for the daily texture of the shared life, what it meant for the quality of Charles's emotional availability, for the specific distance that was the consistent feature of his engagement with her, for the particular way that the gap between what she needed from the marriage and what the marriage was providing was organized around the specific private reality that the bracelet had first communicated. The first year also told her something about the institution she was inside and the institutional management of the situation she was inside. Nobody talked to her directly about what she was experiencing. Nobody from the institutional world around her engaged with the specific reality of the marriage's difficulties in the honest terms that the honest engagement would have required. The eating disorder was managed through the relevant medical channels. The distress at Balmoral was managed through the institutional mechanisms available for managing a new royal bride's adjustment to the institutional life. The broader reality of what was happening in the marriage was managed through the specific institutional mechanism that had always been the primary mechanism of palace management, the management of the public account in the direction of the required fairy tale, without the engagement with the private reality that the honest account of the marriage would have required. The management served the institutional interest. It did not serve Diana. The serving of the institutional interest at the cost of not serving Diana was the pattern that the first year of the marriage established, and that the subsequent 14 years repeated with the accumulating consequences that the marriage's history documents. William Arthur Philip Louis was born on June 21, 1982, 11 months after the wedding. The birth was the birth of the heir, which was the institutional outcome the marriage had been contracted to produce, and the institutional relief at the birth was the institutional relief of an outcome achieved. The public celebration was the public celebration of the occasion's genuine significance. The heir had arrived, the succession was secured in its immediate dimension, the fairy tale had produced its required next chapter. Diana held her son and experienced the specific quality of the feeling that the birth produced, the genuine, uncomplicated, completely real feeling of a woman for the child she had carried and delivered, and who was now present in the world as a specific person rather than as the institutional outcome that the relevant world's primary frame for the birth identified him as. The feeling was unmanaged in the specific sense that it did not require the management that most of what she was experiencing in the institutional life required. It was simply there, in the form that it was in, without the gap between the private reality and the public account that the marriage had established as the consistent condition of her daily existence. The marriage continued beyond the birth into the second year and the third and the fourth, and the continuing was the continuing of all the specific conditions that the first year had established: the distance, the eating disorder's persistence, the institutional management of the public accounts required fairy tale, the private reality of Camilla's continued presence in Charles's private world, the specific education that the accumulating experience of all of these conditions was providing to Diana about the nature of the institution she was inside and the nature of the tools she would need to navigate it. The education was advancing, the tools were developing. Diana, in the third year of the marriage, was not Diana in the first year. The accumulating experience was producing in her the specific capabilities that the accumulating experience of difficult institutional conditions produces in the people who survive them with their intelligence intact, the accuracy of assessment, the specific understanding of how the relevant world worked and what it required and what it was organized around, the capability that would eventually produce the Panorama interview and the Morton book, and the specific strategic mind that the institutional management of the marriage had never anticipated, the marriage producing in the woman at its center. The bracelet had begun the education. The first years of the marriage were advancing it with the accumulating evidence of daily experience. The lesson being learned was the lesson about the gap, about the distance between the institutional account and the private reality, about the specific mechanisms through which the institution managed that distance, about what the institution would and would not do in the service of the management. The lesson was expensive in the specific ways that all education conducted at personal cost is expensive. Diana was paying for the lesson with the specific currency of the eating disorder and the isolation and the distance from what she needed, and the daily experience of the gap between the fairy tale the institutional management was producing and the private reality she was living inside. The payment was making her more capable. The capability would eventually cost the institution considerably more than the management decisions that had produced the education had been designed to cost. The bracelet was the beginning of the education. The education was still in its early stages, in the first years of the marriage. It had a long way to run. The question of what Camilla Parker Bowles's role in Charles's life actually was, across the 15 years of the Wales marriage, is the question that the official account of the period has most consistently declined to address in the direct terms that the available evidence warrants, and the declining has always been organized around the specific institutional interest in the management of the Wales marriage's public account, rather than around any genuine uncertainty about what the evidence supports. The evidence supports the conclusion that the relationship between Charles and Camilla continued across the full 15 years of the Wales marriage in a form that went beyond the social proximity of two people in the same social world, and that constituted a sustained primary emotional connection whose maintenance was the organizing fact of Charles's private emotional life throughout the period. The conclusion is not a conclusion this account reaches through the dramatization of the available evidence in the direction of maximum scandal. It is the conclusion that the available evidence most directly supports when the evidence is examined honestly rather than managed toward the institutional interest in the alternative account. The alternative account is the account of a man who had a significant relationship before his marriage, that the marriage concluded, who may have maintained a friendship with the woman he had previously been in a relationship with, in the way that adults sometimes maintain friendships with former romantic partners, and whose marriage's difficulties were the difficulties of two incompatible people struggling with the institutional demands of a very public life, rather than the difficulties of a marriage whose primary emotional reality was located outside it from its beginning. The alternative account is the account that the palace's management of the relevant information across the relevant period was organized around producing and sustaining. The evidence does not support it in the specific terms that the honest examination requires. Camilla and Charles were in contact throughout the marriage. The contact took various forms across the 15 years. The telephone calls, that the recording of one of which became the Camillagate tape published in 1993, the social occasions that the overlapping social world they both inhabited provided as the natural contexts for contact between two people who moved in the same circles, and the specific private occasions that the social world's management of the contact made available in the conditions that the relevant world's code of discretion was organized to provide. The telephone calls are the most directly documented form of the contact, because the recording of the 1989 conversation provided the public record with a primary source whose authenticity was not seriously disputed, and whose content was unambiguous about the nature of the relationship it documented. The conversation was the conversation of two people whose intimacy was the intimacy of a long-sustained, genuine connection. The ease, the humor, the specific quality of two people who knew each other in the specific way that people know each other when the knowing has been built across years of genuine shared experience, rather than across the managed surface of a social relationship. The recording's content has been analyzed extensively in the public record since its publication, and the analysis has consistently produced the same conclusion about what the content reveals: that the relationship it documented was not a historical connection being maintained as a social friendship, but an active and intimate personal relationship whose specific language and whose specific emotional texture were the language and the texture of two people who were genuinely close in the primary sense of that word, rather than in the secondary sense that former romantic partners who have maintained a social friendship occupy. The social occasions provided the contexts for the contact's physical dimensions. The relevant social world, the polo circuit, the country house weekend social circuit, the specific occasions of the aristocratic and upper-class world that both Charles and Camilla moved through as regular participants, was a world that placed two people with a shared history in the same rooms, at the same events, with the specific regularity that the relevant social calendar produced. The contact at those occasions was the contact of the relevant world's social occasions, which meant it was contact that occurred within the specific social management of the relevant world's code of discretion, rather than in the private settings that would have required more explicit concealment. The code of discretion managed the contact's public account. The contact continued within the management. Diana knew about the contact. The knowledge accumulated across the years of the marriage, through the specific accumulation of evidence that sustained observation of a marriage partner's private behavior produces in the person observing it. The telephone calls were part of the evidence. Diana described in her accounts of the marriage the specific experience of encountering Charles in circumstances where the evidence of the telephone contact with Camilla was available to her observation, the specific quality of discovering that the contact was sustained and regular rather than occasional and social. The social occasions were part of the evidence. Diana attended some of the events that Camilla also attended. and the specific quality of her observation of Charles's engagement at those occasions provided the specific evidence that direct observation of a marriage partner's behavior in the presence of the person whose role in that partner's private life you are assessing produces. She was watching. The watching produced the specific accumulation of evidence that the watching of someone whose conduct is being assessed for its implications consistently produces in the assessor the accumulation of specific observations that individually might be managed into the alternative account and that collectively produced a picture whose honest assessment the alternative account could not sustain. The picture was the picture this account has been describing, a man whose primary emotional connection was located outside the marriage throughout the marriage's duration, who maintained that connection through the sustained forms the relevant world's management made available, and whose availability within the marriage for the specific quality of intimate emotional engagement that the marriage required was consistently reduced by the location of the primary connection. The specific occasions where Camilla's presence in Charles's private world was most visible to Diana are documented across Diana's own accounts of the marriage's private texture. The accounts she provided to Andrew Morton for the book published in 1992 and the accounts she provided in the Panorama interview in 1995 describe the specific experience of living inside a marriage whose private reality was consistently organized around the presence of another person in her husband's emotional life, not as a historical fact being managed into appropriate distance, but as the ongoing and primary fact of his private emotional existence. The Morton accounts describe specific incidents: Charles receiving telephone calls from Camilla, Charles's behavior at social occasions where Camilla was present, the specific quality of the distance between Diana and Charles that was produced by the private reality and that distinguished it from the ordinary distance that marriages in difficult periods produce, the distance of someone whose primary emotional orientation was toward another person, rather than the distance of someone who was simply struggling with the institutional demands of a very public shared life. The Panorama interview addressed the Camilla reality in the specific terms that Diana's development as a communicator across the years of the marriage had produced in her: direct, specific, organized around the concrete evidence rather than the general impression, delivered in the first person with the specific authority of someone whose proximity to the relevant situation gave the account its specific credibility. She was asked whether she believed Charles's relationship with Camilla had been an impediment to the marriage's functioning. Her answer was the answer of someone who had spent 15 years accumulating the specific evidence that honest assessment of the answer required. The answer was yes. The delivery of the answer in those specific terms, on the BBC, to an audience of 23 million viewers, was the delivery of the inside account that the institutional management of the marriage's public narrative had spent 15 years organizing against. The institutional management's organization against the inside account is the subject of Part 7 of this account. What requires examination here, in the context of Camilla's role during the marriage, is the specific quality of what the role was and what it produced in the three people most directly affected by it. For Charles, the role was the role of the primary emotional connection, the person whose presence in his private life was the organizing fact of his private emotional reality across the 15 years of the marriage. The maintenance of the connection alongside the marriage was the maintenance of the thing that the institutional management had been organized around making possible in the specific conditions of the Wales marriage, and the maintenance required the specific forms of management that the relevant world's code of discretion provided, and that Charles deployed with the consistency of someone for whom the maintenance of the primary connection was the non-negotiable element of the private reality he was managing. For Camilla, the role was the role she had occupied across the preceding 11 years of the connection's development, the primary emotional relationship alongside the formal structures of both their lives. The marriage had changed the formal structure of Charles's situation without changing the private reality of the connection, and Camilla's management of her position within the changed formal structure was the management of someone whose understanding of the relevant framework was complete and whose practical capability for managing her position within it was fully developed. She was inside the relevant framework. She had been inside it for 11 years before the Wales wedding. She continued inside it across the 15 years of the Wales marriage, with the specific competence of someone for whom the framework was the natural condition of the situation, rather than a novel challenge requiring adaptation. The specific emotional cost of the role across those 15 years is not something Camilla has ever addressed directly in the public record, and the honest account acknowledges the limitation that her silence imposes on the available assessment of her private experience of the period. What the indirect evidence supports is the conclusion that the role's costs were real, that maintaining a sustained primary connection with a man whose formal life was organized around a commitment to another woman, in conditions where the connection's maintenance required the specific management of the relevant world's code rather than the normal expressions of an acknowledged relationship, produced its own specific costs in the person maintaining it across 15 years. The costs are visible in the specific texture of the public account of Camilla's life during the period, the Parker Bowles marriage's own difficulties, the specific quality of the social world she was managing, the particular conditions of someone whose primary private reality was required to remain the private reality rather than the acknowledged reality across the full span of the marriage's duration. For Diana, the role that Camilla occupied in Charles's life was the organizing fact of the marriage's private reality from the Bracelet's discovery forward, and the specific ways that the organizing fact shaped Diana's experience of the marriage are the ways that this account has been examining across its preceding sections. The distance, the specific quality of the emotional availability that Charles's primary connection's location outside the marriage produced, the accumulating evidence across the years that the gap between the marriage's public account and its private reality was not a gap that time and the normal processes of marital adjustment were going to close. The accumulation of the evidence produced in Diana, the specific education that the Bracelet had begun. The education was the education of someone learning, through the daily experience of a marriage organized around the private reality the Bracelet had first communicated, what the institution she was inside was, and how it worked, and what it was organized around, and what the tools were for navigating it from the position of someone whose interests were not the interests the institution had been designed to serve. The tool development was the most significant product of the education, because the tools that the education produced were the tools that the Panorama interview and the Morton book, and Diana's strategic management of her own public account across the later years of the marriage demonstrated, the specific capability for navigating the institutional environment from the inside that the inside experience of the education had produced. The education required the teacher. The teacher was the private reality of Camilla's role in Charles's life across 15 years of the marriage. The teaching was the teaching of the daily experience of a marriage, organized around an absence at its emotional center, the specific absence of the primary emotional connection that the marriage required, and that the primary connection's location outside the marriage consistently prevented the marriage from having. Camilla did not intend to teach Diana anything. The relationship between the two women in the relevant period was not a relationship organized around any form of direct engagement. They were not friends. They were not in regular contact. They did not have the kind of relationship that deliberate influence requires. The teaching was the inadvertent teaching of a situation, the specific education that the experience of living inside a marriage, organized around a specific private reality, provides to the person living inside it, with sufficient intelligence to learn from the experience what the experience has to teach. Diana had sufficient intelligence. The experience had considerable things to teach. The teaching continued across 15 years and produced the specific capability that the institutional management had never anticipated and could never adequately manage once it had been produced. The bracelet was the first lesson. Camilla's role across the marriage was the curriculum. Diana was the student who learned it better than the institution had intended to allow. The party was at Ormley Lodge, the Richmond home of Annabel Goldsmith, in 1989. The occasion was a birthday celebration organized around the specific social world that both Diana and Camilla moved through in their different capacities. Diana, as the Princess of Wales, whose presence at significant social occasions in the relevant world was both expected and managed. Camilla, as a regular participant in the aristocratic and upper-class social circuit that the polo world and the country house weekend calendar organized around itself. Both women were there. The confrontation that the accounts of the evening identify as the most direct personal engagement between them across the full span of the Wales marriage happened in the circumstances that the specific occasion produced. The accounts of the confrontation are the accounts that Diana gave to Andrew Morton in the conversations that became the foundation of the 1992 biography, supplemented by the accounts of people who were present at the party and who have described, in the specific indirect ways that the relevant world's code of discretion makes available, the quality of what happened between the two women in the circumstances the evening produced. The accounts are consistent enough in their essential elements to support a clear reconstruction of the confrontation's basic character, if not its verbatim content. Diana found herself in a room with Camilla in circumstances where the specific management of the social occasion had reduced the normal social distance between them to the point where the direct engagement that the normal social distance was designed to prevent became available. The management of the normal social distance was the management that the relevant social world's code of discretion applied to situations of exactly this kind, the management of the physical positioning of the relevant parties at social occasions in ways that prevented the direct engagement whose occurrence would produce consequences the relevant world's code was designed to prevent. The management failed on this occasion, or was circumvented, or Diana herself deliberately moved through the management's provisions toward the direct engagement that the provisions were designed to prevent. The accounts of Diana's decision to seek Camilla out and speak to her directly are accounts of someone who had decided that the accumulated years of the knowledge the bracelet had begun and the marriage's private reality had confirmed were sufficient grounds for the direct engagement whose occurrence the relevant world had been managing to prevent. She told the other people in the room to leave. The accounts of this moment describe a Diana whose decision was clear and whose manner communicated the clarity to the people around her, the specific quality of someone who had decided what she was going to do and whose decision was sufficiently visible in her manner that the people in the room understood what was being requested of them and responded to the understanding by doing what was being requested. The room emptied. Diana and Camilla were alone. What happened in the specific privacy of that room is documented primarily through Diana's own account of it, delivered to Morton with the specific directness that characterized Diana's accounts of the marriage's most significant private moments. The account describes a confrontation whose character was the character of Diana's general mode of engagement with the difficult private realities of her life at the relevant period. Direct, specific, organized around the concrete evidence rather than the general impression, delivered with the combination of emotional intensity and specific articulateness that Diana's developing capability as a communicator was producing across the marriage's middle years. She told Camilla that she knew about the relationship. The telling was not the tentative disclosure of someone uncertain about the accuracy of her knowledge. It was the statement of someone whose knowledge had been accumulating across 8 years of the marriage's private texture, and who was stating what the accumulation had produced as a settled conclusion rather than as a speculative assessment. She knew. She was stating what she knew. The statement was the statement of someone who had arrived at the confrontation with the specific purpose of putting the knowledge she had accumulated into the direct engagement that the relevant world had been managing to prevent her from putting it into. Camilla's response to the statement of Diana's knowledge was the response of someone whose own understanding of the situation was considerably more complete than Diana's, and whose management of the confrontation therefore operated from a position of greater situational knowledge. The accounts of Camilla's conduct in the confrontation describe someone who was composed in the specific way that people are composed when the situation they are being confronted about is a situation they have been managing across a long period and whose management has produced the specific kind of settled clarity about the situation's dimensions that long management of a difficult thing produces. She acknowledged the relationship, not in the specific terms of a formal admission or a detailed disclosure, but in the specific register of someone who understood that the denial of what Diana was stating was not the available response in the conditions of the specific confrontation, because the evidence that Diana was stating the knowledge on the basis of was evidence whose existence made the denial a response that would not serve Camilla's own interests or anyone else's in the specific circumstances of the confrontation. The acknowledgement produced in Diana the specific response that the accumulation of 8 years of the marriage's private reality and the direct confirmation of the confrontation combined to produce the response of someone whose knowledge had just been directly confirmed by the person whose confirmation was the most significant available, and whose confirmation therefore removed the last possible alternative account of the situation that Diana might have maintained against the accumulated evidence. The removal of the alternative account was the most significant dimension of what the confrontation produced for Diana, because the alternative account had been the account that the institutional management of the marriage's public narrative had been organized around sustaining, and that Diana had been managing her own understanding against across the years of the marriage's evidence. The alternative account was the account in which the Camilla relationship was historical rather than current, in which Charles's distance within the marriage was the product of the institutional demands on both parties rather than the product of the primary emotional connection's location outside the marriage, in which the specific quality of the marriage's private texture was the texture of institutional difficulty rather than the texture of a marriage organized around a private reality the public account was not acknowledging. The confirmation ended the alternative account's availability as a counter to the accumulated evidence. Diana could not, after the confrontation, maintain the alternative account against what the confrontation had directly confirmed. The confirmation was the specific thing the institutional management of the marriage's public narrative had been organized for 8 years to prevent from being delivered to Diana in the direct terms that the confrontation delivered it, and the delivery produced in Diana the specific combination of the validation of her own accumulated assessment and the devastation of the confirmation's removal of the hope that the alternative account had always allowed her to maintain. Camilla said something in the confrontation that Diana's accounts of it consistently identify as one of the most significant things said to her across the full span of the marriage's 15 years. She said, in the specific terms that Diana subsequently described to Morton and that Morton recorded, "You have everything you ever wanted. You have all the men in the world falling in love with you, and you have 2 beautiful children. What more could you want?" The statement was remarkable in several specific respects that Diana's own accounts of it addressed directly. It was remarkable in its assumption about what Diana had and what Diana wanted, the assumption that the public life, the public attention, the children, constituted the full account of Diana's situation and its requirements, and that the specific private thing Diana was confronting Camilla about was a thing whose significance was diminished rather than amplified by the presence of the public things that the statement acknowledged. The statement was also remarkable as the expression of Camilla's own understanding of what the confrontation was about and what the relevant framework required of the people inside it. The framework required the public life and the private reality to be understood as simultaneously operative dimensions of a situation that the relevant people managed within the relevant code rather than in competition with each other, and Camilla's statement was the expression of that framework's logic. The logic in which Diana's public life and her private life were not in the competition that Diana was treating the confrontation as being about, but were simply the different simultaneously operative dimensions of the situation that both women were inside. Diana did not accept the framework's logic. She never accepted it across the full 15 years of the marriage, because the framework's logic was the logic of the relevant social world that Camilla had been formed in, and that Diana had not been formed in the specific way the framework's logic required, for its acceptance as the natural condition of the situation, rather than as the specific wrong, whose confrontation the confrontation was organized around performing. The confrontation ended. The party continued around it. The social occasion resumed its social management of the specific reality that the confrontation had addressed, and that the social occasion's resumption was required to manage back into the background of the normal social life of the relevant world. What the confrontation produced in Diana was the specific thing that direct confirmations of long accumulated evidence produce in the people who receive them, the combination of the validation of the accurate assessment and the specific devastation of the hope that the alternative account's maintenance had allowed. The hope was gone, the knowledge was confirmed, the marriage continued. The continuation after the confirmation was the continuation of the specific marriage that the confirmation had established as the marriage's actual private reality, a marriage whose primary emotional reality was located outside it, whose public account was organized around the institutional requirement rather than around the honest account, and whose continuation was the continuation of an institutional arrangement rather than a genuine intimate partnership. Diana continued inside the arrangement. The continuation was not the continuation of someone who had accepted the arrangement as the acceptable condition of her existence. It was the continuation of someone whose intelligence and whose developing capability were increasingly organized around the question of what to do with what the confrontation had confirmed, and how to navigate the institution whose management of the relevant information had made the confrontation necessary in the first place, how to use the confirmation the confrontation had provided in the service of the specific purposes that the continuing marriage now required her to identify. The identification of the purposes was the development that the subsequent years of the marriage produced in Diana as its most significant consequence. The purposes were the purposes that the Panorama interview eventually expressed: the honest public account of the marriage's private reality, delivered to the largest available audience, in the institutional context that had the least available management tools for preventing its delivery. The confrontation at Ormley Lodge was the specific private moment that the Panorama interview's public account was the eventual public expression of. The 8 years between the confrontation and the interview were the 8 years in which the specific capability that the confrontation's confirmation had made necessary was being developed. The development of the capability is part 8 of this account. What the confrontation itself produced, in the most immediate terms, was the specific thing that direct engagements with long-avoided private realities always produce in the people who seek them: the ending of the alternative account's availability as a comfort against the accumulated evidence, and the specific clarity of someone who has had the courage to seek the direct engagement with the private reality, and who is now inside the knowledge that the engagement has confirmed, without the management that the avoidance of the direct engagement had allowed. The clarity was devastating. It was also the beginning of the specific capability that the devastating clarity makes possible in the people who survive it with their intelligence intact, the capability to navigate the situation that the clarity has revealed in the terms that the clarity requires, without the management of the hope that the alternative account had provided. Diana survived the clarity with her intelligence intact. The capability was beginning. The institution had not anticipated the capability. The confrontation was where the development of the capability that the institution had not anticipated was most clearly established as the inevitable product of the marriage's continuation in the conditions the confrontation had confirmed. Camilla had said, "You have everything you ever wanted." Diana had understood what the statement revealed about the framework Camilla was operating within and what the framework required of the people inside it. She had decided, at some level in the immediate aftermath of the confrontation, if not in the confrontation itself, that the framework was not the framework she was going to accept as the organizing logic of her existence inside the marriage. The decision was the beginning of the management culture's most significant problem. The problem was Diana. The problem had always been Diana. The confrontation confirmed it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The palace knew about Camilla from before the wedding. This sentence requires stating plainly, and without the qualification, that the institutional management of the relevant information has always organized the public account around, because the qualification is itself the management. The specific rhetorical device of uncertainty and hedging that converts a straightforward institutional fact into a contested claim requiring evidential support that the institutional management of the relevant information has always been organized around preventing from being assembled. The institutional knowledge of the Charles and Camilla relationship before and during the Wales marriage was not the knowledge of specific individuals who had happened to observe specific things and who had maintained that knowledge personally. It was the organizational knowledge of an institution whose professional function included the monitoring and assessment of the personal lives of its senior members against the requirements of those members' institutional positions, and whose monitoring of Charles's personal life across the years of the engagement and the marriage had produced, through the ordinary operation of that professional function, accurate knowledge of the private reality that the public account of the marriage was organized around not acknowledging. The private secretaries who served Charles across the relevant period had the knowledge. The household officials whose professional function placed them in proximity to the private dimensions of Charles's daily life had the knowledge. The protection officers who accompanied Charles to the social occasions and the private meetings that the relevant social world organized around itself had the knowledge. The courtiers whose professional function included the assessment of the institutional landscape around the senior royals, had the knowledge. Each of these categories of people had the knowledge through the ordinary operation of their professional functions, rather than through any deliberate surveillance or investigation, and each of them managed the knowledge within the institutional framework that the palace's management culture organized around the management of sensitive private information about its senior members. The institutional framework was the framework of strategic silence, the specific management approach that this account and the earlier accounts in this series have examined in other contexts, and that was the consistent management response to every private reality that the public account of the relevant person required to remain unacknowledged. The strategic silence was not the simple silence of institutional ignorance. It was the organized silence of an institution that had assessed what it knew and had decided that the management of the knowledge through non-disclosure was the appropriate institutional response to the knowledge's implications. The assessment produced the decision. The decision was the decision that the palace made. Across the full period from the engagement announcement in February 1981 through the full 15 years of the Wales marriage, that the Charles and Camilla relationship was a private reality whose management through non-disclosure served the institutional interest in the public account of the marriage that the institution had contracted to produce and sustain. The institutional interest was clear. The Wales marriage was the institution's most significant public investment of the relevant period. The succession secured, the fairy tale produced, the public's emotional investment in the royal family sustained through the specific occasion of the fairy tale wedding and its subsequent narrative. The management of the public account in the direction of the fairy tale narrative required the management of every private reality that the fairy tale narrative's sustaining could not accommodate, and the Charles and Camilla relationship was the most significant of the private realities whose management the sustaining of the fairy tale narrative required. The management was organized around two primary instruments. The first was the control of information, the specific decisions about what information was provided to Diana about the private reality of Charles's life, what information was provided to the press about the private reality of the marriage, and what information was made available to the public account of the marriage's development through the institutional communications channels that the palace controlled. The information provided to Diana about the private reality of Charles's life before the wedding was the information organized around the non-disclosure of the Charles and Camilla relationship's status at the point of the engagement. Diana was not told about the relationship in the explicit terms that would have required her to process its implications before committing to the marriage. The non-disclosure was not the product of a formal institutional decision made at a specific moment by specific people whose identities the institutional record would allow to be identified with confidence. It was the product of the institutional culture's ambient understanding that the disclosure of the information would complicate the institutional requirement to produce the marriage, and the institutional culture's ambient understanding was sufficient to produce the non-disclosure without the formal decision that would have been required for the producing of the disclosure. The information provided to the press about the private reality of the marriage was managed through the palace's press operation with the specific professional competence that the press operation had developed across decades of managing sensitive information about the royal family. The press operations management of the Charles and Camilla relationship during the marriage years was the management of information through the cultivation of the specific press relationships whose maintenance gave the palace sufficient leverage over the relevant coverage to prevent the Camilla reality from becoming the dominant public account of the marriage's private texture for the decade that the management sustained the prevention. The second primary instrument was the management of access, the specific control of who had proximity to what dimensions of the relevant private reality, and the management of the proximity in ways that prevented the assembly of the complete picture that the honest account required. Diana's access to the specific private dimensions of Charles's relationship with Camilla was managed through the social and physical arrangements of the marriage's daily life in ways that made the complete picture difficult to assemble even for someone with Diana's intelligence and her accumulating motivation to assemble it. The management was partially effective. It was partially effective in the sense that the public account of the Wales marriage maintained the fairy tale narrative as the dominant public account for the decade between the wedding in 1981 and the specific crisis of 1992 that the institutional management could no longer contain within the fairy tale framework. The decade of maintenance was a genuine institutional achievement, produced through the sustained application of the two primary instruments, with the professional competence of an institution that had been managing sensitive information about its senior members across the full length of the 20th century. The management was also, across the full 15 years of the marriage, insufficient in the specific ways that matter most for the honest account of its operation. It was insufficient for Diana, who was inside the marriage, and who was accumulating, through the daily experience of the marriage's private texture, the specific evidence that the management's non-disclosure had been designed to prevent her from assembling. The management of the information environment outside Diana could not manage the information that Diana's daily experience of the marriage's private reality was generating inside it, and the inside information was the information that the Morton book and the Panorama interview eventually deployed in the public account with the specific authority of inside knowledge. Michael Shea served as the Queen's press secretary from 1978 to 1987, across the crucial early period of the Wales marriage, when the fairy tale narrative was being most actively produced and sustained. His professional management of the press relationship around the Wales marriage in its early period was the management of someone whose primary professional function was the maintenance of the required public account, and whose professional assessment of the challenges to that maintenance was the assessment of a professional in the relevant field with decades of experience in the management of sensitive institutional information. His private assessments of the Charles and Camilla relationship's implications for the institutional management of the Wales marriage's public account, as described by people who worked alongside him in the relevant period, were the assessments of someone who understood with complete accuracy what the private reality was and what the management of its public account required. The understanding included the understanding that the management was providing the institution with the specific public account it needed, at the cost of not providing Diana with the specific information she needed, and the understanding of that cost was the understanding that the institutional framework organized around the prioritization of the institutional interest over the individual's interest, consistently produced in the professionals who operated within it. Geoffrey Crawford, who managed the press dimensions of the palace's operation across the later period of the marriage, when the management challenges were most acute, maintained the professional assessment of a man whose function required him to manage information about a situation whose private reality was considerably more complex than the public account he was managing could accommodate. His management of the specific press crises that the marriage's deterioration produced across the early 1990s was the management of increasingly inadequate tools applied to an increasingly uncontainable situation, and the inadequacy of the tools was the inadequacy that the institutional management culture's fundamental approach to the Wales marriage had always contained as its primary structural limitation. The structural limitation was the limitation that this account and the preceding accounts in this series have identified as the consistent feature of the palace's management of its most significant institutional challenges: the prioritization of the management of the public account over the engagement with the private reality, which produces the specific outcome of an institutional management that is effective for as long as the private reality can be contained within the management's reach, and that fails catastrophically when the private reality escapes the management's reach through the specific channels that the management could not anticipate and could not control. Diana was the channel the management could not anticipate and could not control. The specific quality of Diana's intelligence and the specific character of her developing capability made her the channel through which the private reality escaped the management in the most publicly consequential way available, not through the gradual accumulation of press coverage that the palace's management of the press relationship was designed to prevent, not through the leak of specific information through the specific institutional channels that the palace's management of its own information environment was designed to control, but through the direct deployment of the inside account by the person whose inside position gave the account its specific authority. The inside account was the account whose authority the management could not reduce to the level of the alternative account's credibility, because the inside account came from the person most centrally located in the relevant situation and whose proximity to the private reality the alternative account was organized around challenging was the proximity that the public account could not dismiss in the specific terms that the management culture applied to outside challenges to the institutional narrative. The palace knew about Camilla. The palace managed the knowledge through the strategic silence that the institutional culture organized around the management of private realities, whose acknowledgement would have complicated the institutional account. The management was effective for a decade. It was insufficient across the full 15 years of the marriage, because the specific private reality it was managing was a private reality that was producing, in the person inside the marriage, the specific capability that the management's consistent non-engagement with the private reality was making necessary. The management produced the problem it was designed to prevent. The problem was the inside account. The inside account was Diana. Diana was the product of 15 years of the management culture's consistent choice of the institutional interest over the individual's welfare. The choice was the institution's consistent choice. The product of the choice was the institution's most significant 20th century crisis. The palace knew what it was doing when it managed the knowledge the way it managed it. It did not know what it was producing. What it was producing was Diana. The producing was the most consequential thing the management culture had produced in the relevant period. The institution has never fully reckoned with having produced it. The woman who sat across from Martin Bashir on November 5, 1995, and delivered the Panorama interview that 23 million people watched, was not the 20-year-old who had found the bracelet in Buckingham Palace 14 years earlier. The distance between those two versions of the same person is the distance that the education of the intervening 14 years had produced, and the education is the subject of this section, the specific process through which the woman who had entered the Wales marriage without the tools required to navigate the institution she had entered developed, across the years of the marriage's private reality, the specific capabilities that the Panorama interview demonstrated. The development was not planned. Diana did not enter the marriage with a strategy for developing the capabilities that the marriage's private reality would make necessary. She entered it with genuine feeling for Charles, genuine excitement about the life she was beginning, and the specific knowledge of the bracelet that she had no framework for at the time of its discovery, and that the marriage's subsequent years would progressively provide the framework for. The capabilities were not a strategy imposed on the experience. They were the product of the experience, developed through the specific interaction of Diana's natural intelligence with the specific conditions of the institutional life she was inside and learning from. The natural intelligence is the starting point for the account of the development, because the development was the development of a natural intelligence encountering the specific conditions of an institutional environment and producing, through the encounter, the specific capabilities that the intelligence and the conditions combine to generate. Diana's natural intelligence was the intelligence of someone who read people and situations with the specific accuracy of genuine emotional perceptiveness, the ability to understand what other people were feeling and what the situation she was in was actually about, organized around the real texture of the experience rather than around the managed account that the relevant world preferred to produce of it. The intelligence was not initially the intelligence of a strategic mind, in the specific sense of a mind organized around the deliberate achievement of specific purposes through the calculated deployment of available means. It was the intelligence of someone who was perceptive and warm and genuinely present in the situations she was in, without the specific additional quality of strategic organization that the institutional environment would develop in it across the years of the marriage. The strategic organization was the quality that the institution produced in the natural intelligence through the specific conditions of the marriage's private reality, through the daily experience of living inside an institution whose management of her situation was organized around purposes she was not consulted about and interests that were not hers, and whose navigation therefore required the specific capability of understanding not just what was happening, but why it was happening, and what the understanding of the why made possible in terms of navigation. The first years of the marriage had provided the raw material of the education without the framework for organizing it into the understanding the framework would eventually make possible: the bracelet's knowledge, the eating disorder, the Balmoral isolation, the distance within the marriage, the specific quality of the institutional management's response to her difficulties. All of these were the raw material of an education whose framework Diana was not yet equipped to provide for herself in the first years of the marriage. The raw material was accumulating. The framework for its organization into the understanding the education required was being developed alongside the accumulation. The framework came from multiple sources across the years of the marriage's development. It came from the specific people Diana sought out and formed relationships with across the years when the isolation of the institutional life was making the seeking of genuine human connection outside the institutional context a practical necessity rather than a social preference. The conversations with people who had the specific knowledge of the institutional world and its operations that Diana was in the process of accumulating provided, through the specific quality of the conversations they organized around themselves, the framework for understanding what the raw material was the raw material of. James Gilby, whose relationship with Diana across the early 1990s included the specific telephone conversations whose recording became the Squidgygate tape published in 1992, was among the people whose conversations with Diana across the relevant period provided the specific emotional support and the specific engaged attention that the institutional isolation had made most unavailable inside the marriage. The conversations were the conversations of someone processing the accumulated raw material of the institutional experience in the company of someone who was genuinely interested in her processing of it, and the processing across those conversations was the processing that the framework's development required. James Hewitt, whose relationship with Diana across the mid to late 1980s has been the subject of considerable public documentation, including his own account of it, was among the people who provided the specific dimension of sustained personal engagement that the marriage's emotional distance had made most acutely unavailable inside it. The relationship's significance for the education's development was the significance of a relationship that provided Diana with the experience of the specific quality of engaged personal attention whose absence within the marriage was the most consistently documented dimension of the marriage's private reality, the experience that gave her the specific reference point for understanding, through contrast with its presence in the alternative relationship, the quality of its absence in the primary one. The reference point was part of the framework. The education was not simply the education of accumulated negative evidence about the marriage's private reality. It was the education of accumulated understanding about what the private reality was and what the understanding of it made available in terms of the specific navigation of the institutional environment whose management of the private reality was the primary challenge the education was being organized around addressing. The Andrew Morton project was the first major deployment of the education's accumulated product in the public account, and its development across the early months of 1991, when Diana was conducting the tape-recorded interviews that Morton subsequently used as the foundation of the 1992 biography, was the development of the education's deployment in a specific strategic form. The decision to cooperate with Morton to provide the inside account in the tape-recorded form that gave the account its specific evidential authority was a decision that required the strategic capability that the education had been developing, the capability to identify the specific tool available for the specific purpose the tool was being considered for, to assess the tool's effectiveness against the purpose's requirements, and to deploy the tool with the timing and the method that the effectiveness of the deployment required. The deployment required careful management of the access to the relevant information. Diana did not simply sit down with Morton and tell him everything she knew about the marriage's private reality in an unorganized disclosure. She provided the specific account that the specific purpose of the project required, the account organized around the dimensions of the private reality that the public account had been managing to prevent from reaching the public, delivered in the form that the tape-recorded interviews made available, in the circumstances whose management gave the project the specific protection that the institutional management's eventual response to it would require. The protection was the protection of the inside account's credibility. Diana understood, by the time of the Morton project, that the institutional management's primary response to any challenge to the public account's narrative was the response of cultivated skepticism, the management of the reception of the challenge through the cultivation of the relevant world's skepticism about the challenge's source and the challenge's reliability. The protection against the skepticism was the specific evidential authority of the inside account itself, the authority of a primary source whose proximity to the private reality gave the account a credibility that the institutional management's skepticism cultivation could reduce but could not eliminate. The Morton book's publication in June 1992 produced the specific institutional crisis that the education's first major public deployment had been organized to produce. The crisis required the institutional management to respond in ways that the institutional management culture was not designed to produce, not the management of the challenge's reception, but the direct engagement with the challenge's substance, that the challenge's specific authority made the management of the reception insufficient to address. The crisis of 1992 was the first major demonstration of what the education's product was capable of producing in the institutional environment that had generated the education. The demonstration was partial. The Morton book produced the crisis, and the crisis produced the separation announcement of December 1992, and the separation produced the specific new conditions of Diana's relationship to the institutional environment, the conditions of someone who was formally separated from the marriage, but still inside the institutional world, whose management of the public account remained the primary challenge the education was organized around addressing. The formal separation produced a new phase of the education's development. The new phase was the phase in which the institutional management of Diana's position in the post-separation period provided the specific additional raw material for the education's advancement. The management of her HRH status, the management of her charitable activities' institutional dimensions, the specific quality of the institutional environment's response to her continuing public presence as someone whose formal institutional position had been reduced, but whose public significance had not been reduced in the specific way the institutional management of the formal position's reduction had anticipated. The public significance was the specific asset the education had been developing the capability to deploy, and the post-separation period was the period in which the capability's deployment became the primary strategic activity of Diana's relationship to the institutional environment. The charities. The public engagements conducted in the specific register that the education had developed as the most effective register for the deployment of the inside account's public significance. The management of her press relationships in the specific way that the education's understanding of the press world's operation made available for the management of the institutional environment's primary vulnerability, its dependence on the public account's maintenance for the institutional legitimacy the public account was organized around producing. The Panorama interview was the education's most fully developed deployment. The specific capability it demonstrated was the capability that 14 years of the education had produced, the ability to deliver the inside account in the form that the largest available audience could receive it, in the institutional context that had the least available management tools for preventing its delivery, with the specific strategic organization of the account's content that the education's development had made available. The interview's content was the content of a strategic mind operating at the full development of the education's product. The specific dimensions of the private reality that the interview addressed, the specific framing of those dimensions, in the terms that the public accounts management had always organized around preventing, the specific timing of the delivery, in the conditions of the marriage's post-separation period, when the institutional management's tools for containing the delivery were most reduced. All of these were the product of the strategic capability that the education had developed across 14 years of living inside the institutional environment, whose management of her situation was the primary condition of the education. The Panorama interview reached 23 million viewers. The institutional management of the Wales marriage's public account had spent 14 years preventing the inside account from reaching the public in the direct terms the interview delivered it in. The prevention had failed because the prevention had produced, through the specific conditions it imposed on Diana, the specific strategic capability that the interview demonstrated. The education had produced its most significant graduate. The institution had provided the education. The graduation was the interview. The interview was the most consequential single hour of television in the modern history of the British monarchy. The bracelet had been the first lesson. The interview was where the lessons ended, and the capability they had produced was fully deployed. The institution had never anticipated the capability. The capability had always been the inevitable product of the education the institution had been providing across 14 years of the marriage's private reality. The bracelet was the beginning. The Panorama interview was what the beginning had produced. The institution is still managing the consequences of what the beginning produced. Objects acquire significance through what happens around them, rather than through what they are, and the significance they acquire through what happens around them persists in the historical record longer than the objects themselves. The bracelet that Diana found in Buckingham Palace in July 1981 almost certainly no longer exists in a form that anyone has access to. Camilla received it, and what she did with it in the subsequent years and decades is not something the available record addresses. The object is gone, in the practical sense of being unavailable for examination, and what remains is the significance that what happened around it produced, and the significance is what this section is organized around examining. The bracelet's significance in the historical record of the Wales marriage is the significance of the first moment. The first piece of evidence that the marriage Diana was about to enter was organized around a private reality that the institutional management of its public account had decided not to disclose to her, and that the non-disclosure was not an oversight, but the product of the specific institutional choice to prioritize the management of the public account over the provision of the honest information that the person most centrally affected by the choice most required. The first moment's significance is the significance of the beginning, and beginnings organize the things they begin in ways that are difficult to revise once the beginning has occurred. The Wales marriage was organized from its beginning around the gap between the public account and the private reality, because the bracelet's discovery established the gap as the marriage's foundational condition before the marriage had produced a single day of its own history. The condition established in the beginning was the condition that persisted across the 15 years of the marriage's duration, not necessarily in the specific form that the beginning established, but in the specific character of a marriage whose public account and private reality were organized around different facts. The long shadow the bracelet cast across the marriage was cast in the specific form of that character, the gap that the bracelet had first established as the foundational condition. Every subsequent development of the marriage was a development that occurred within the gap's specific conditions, and the gap's conditions shaped every subsequent development in the specific ways that foundational conditions shaped the things they found. The eating disorder was shaped by the gap's conditions. The specific form that Diana's psychological response to the marriage's early period took was the form of someone managing the knowledge of the gap, the specific knowledge of the private reality that the public account was not organized around acknowledging, through the body's language of distress, rather than through the direct engagement with the reality that the institutional environment consistently prevented her from having. The body expressed what the institutional context required to remain unexpressed in any other form, and the eating disorder was the expression. The isolation was shaped by the gap's conditions. Diana's experience of isolation within the institutional environment of the Wales marriage, the specific loneliness of someone inside the most watched marriage in the world, who was unable to share the specific private reality of the marriage with the institutional world around her, because the institutional management of the public account required the private reality to remain unacknowledged, was the isolation of the gap's conditions imposed on the person inside them. The gap produced the isolation. The isolation was the gap's primary psychological expression in Diana's daily experience of the marriage's private texture. The strategic capability development was shaped by the gap's conditions. The education that the marriage's private reality provided to Diana across the 14 years between the bracelet's discovery and the Panorama interview's delivery was the education that the gap's conditions made necessary. The gap required navigation. The navigation required capability. The capability required development. The development was the product of the gap's conditions imposed on someone with sufficient intelligence to learn from the conditions what the conditions had to teach. The Morton book was shaped by the gap's conditions. The specific decision to cooperate with Andrew Morton to provide the inside account in the form that the tape-recorded interviews made available was a decision whose strategic logic was the logic of the gap's conditions, the logic of someone who understood that the gap between the public account and the private reality was the institutional management's primary vulnerability, and whose deployment of the inside account through the specific channels that the gap's conditions had made available was the deployment organized around the gap's conditions' most effective exploitation. The Panorama interview was shaped by the gap's conditions. the specific content of the interview, the specific framing of the inside account, in the terms that the public accounts management had always organized around preventing, was the content and the framing that the GAP's conditions had made necessary, and that the education the GAP's conditions had provided made possible. The divorce was shaped by the GAP's conditions. The specific terms of the Wales divorce of 1996, the HRH removal, the financial arrangements, the custody provisions, were the terms of an institutional management of the GAP's resolution, in the conditions that the public accounts management had produced across 15 years of the GAP's consistent maintenance. The GAP had been the organizing condition of the marriage. The divorce was the institutional management of the GAP's formal conclusion, in the specific terms that the institutional interest in the public accounts continued management required. The death was shaped by the GAP's conditions, the specific circumstances of Diana's life in the year between the divorce and the Paris crash of August 1997, the post-royal public existence, the specific conditions of someone whose formal institutional position had been removed, but whose public significance had not been reduced in the way the formal position's removal had anticipated, the specific vulnerability of someone navigating the particular conditions of the post-royal public existence in the conditions of the institutional environment's continued management of the public account, were the conditions that the GAP's 15-year existence had produced in the person who had been inside it longest and most directly. The GAP's shadow extended beyond Diana's death into the post-Diana management of the Wales marriage's legacy and beyond. The institutional management of the public account of the Wales marriage's history in the years following Diana's death was the management of the GAP's legacy in the specific conditions that Diana's death had produced, the conditions of a public whose understanding of the gap between the public account and the private reality had been substantially advanced by the Morton book and the Panorama interview, and the specific public education that both had provided, and whose response to Diana's death had demonstrated the specific depth of the public investment in the GAP's honest account rather than in the institutional management's preferred alternative. The rehabilitation of Camilla Parker Bowles across the 8 years between Diana's death and the 2005 wedding was the management of the GAP's legacy in the specific form that the institutional management's post-Diana assessment of the relevant circumstances required. The rehabilitation was the institutional management's attempt to close the gap, to produce a public account of the Charles and Camilla relationship that acknowledged the private reality the gap had been organized around, preventing from being acknowledged, in the specific terms and at the specific pace that the institutional management assessed the public's capacity for the acknowledgement could accommodate. The rehabilitation succeeded in the specific sense that the 2005 wedding produced the formal acknowledgement the institutional management had organized the preceding 8 years to make possible. The gap between the public account and the private reality was formally closed, in the institutional sense of the formal acknowledgement, at the civil ceremony at the Windsor Guildhall on April 9, 2005. The formal closing did not close the gap in the historical record. The historical record of the Wales marriage retains the gap as the foundational condition of the marriage's history, the gap established by the Bracelet's discovery, maintained across 15 years of the marriage's duration, and managed through the institutional management's sustained deployment of the strategic silence that the institutional culture organized around the management of private realities, whose acknowledgement would complicate the institutional account. The Bracelet's shadow is the historical shadow of the gap. The gap is what the Bracelet established on the day of its discovery. The establishment was the beginning that organized the 15 years that followed it. The 15 years organized the subsequent management's response to what the 15 years had produced. The management's response organized the rehabilitation that the subsequent 8 years produced. The rehabilitation organized the formal acknowledgement that the wedding produced. The wedding organized the queenship that the accession confirmed. The Bracelet is at the beginning of a chain whose final link, at the point this account is being written, is Queen Camilla. The chain runs from a gold bracelet with a blue enamel disc bearing 2 letters, discovered by a 20-year-old woman in Buckingham Palace 11 days before her wedding in July 1981, through 15 years of a marriage organized around the gap the discovery established, through the institutional management's sustained deployment of the strategic silence the gap required, through the education the gap's conditions provided to the woman inside them, Through the Panorama interview, the education's product delivered to 23 million viewers. Through the divorce, the delivery made inevitable. Through the death, the divorce's conditions contributed to producing. Through the 8 years of rehabilitation, the death's conditions required. Through the wedding, the rehabilitation made possible. Through the accession, the wedding organized toward. To the queenship, the accession confirmed. The chain is the long shadow the bracelet cast. The shadow is still being cast. The bracelet is gone. The shadow persists in the historical record of everything the bracelet established, maintained, and eventually produced through the specific chain of consequences whose beginning it was. The room froze when Diana placed the bracelet on the table. The freezing was the response of people who understood what the object was and what the placing of it in the space between Diana and the people who had known about it communicated. It communicated that the management had failed in its most fundamental dimension, that the 20-year-old woman who was 11 days from becoming the Princess of Wales had discovered the thing she had not been supposed to discover, and was placing it in the space between herself and the people who had organized the management that had failed to prevent the discovery, and was signaling through the specific gesture of the placing that she understood what the object was and what its presence in Charles's possession communicated about the marriage she was about to enter. The people in the room had known about the bracelet before Diana found it. They had known in the specific way that people in the immediate circle of a senior royal know about the significant dimensions of that royal's private life, through the proximity that the household functions gave them, through the observation that the professional function required, through the specific social intelligence of a world that was organized around the accurate understanding of the private realities behind the public accounts its members were managing. The knowing was the knowing of people who were inside the management operation rather than outside it, and the management operation was the operation that had been organized around preventing Diana from having the knowledge that the bracelet had just delivered to her. The freezing was the specific response of the management operation encountering the failure it had been organized to prevent. The specific quality of the freeze, the stillness, the specific arrested quality of a room in which the people present understood simultaneously what had just happened and what the happening meant for everything that had been organized around preventing it, was the quality of a moment in which the management's fundamental purpose had been revealed as having failed in the most direct available way, by the direct acquisition of the managed information by the person most centrally affected by the management. What the frozen room produced across the subsequent years is the question that this account's final section is organized around answering, and the answer is the answer that the full account of the Wales marriage and its legacy provides. The frozen room produced Diana's 15-year education in the institutional environment she was inside, and the specific capability that the education's product eventually demonstrated. The education began in the freeze, in the specific moment of the bracelet's placing on the table and the room's response to the placing, because the freeze was the first demonstration of what the management of the relevant information looked like from the inside of the management operation, rather than from the outside of it. Diana saw the freeze. She saw what the freeze communicated about the people in the room and their relationship to the information the bracelet had delivered to her. The seeing was the first lesson of the education that the subsequent years advanced through the daily experience of the marriage's private reality. The first lesson was the lesson about the gap, the specific distance between what the institution said and what the private reality was, and the specific relationship of the institution and the people inside it to the management of that distance. The room's freeze communicated the lesson in its most concentrated form. These people knew. They knew and they managed what they knew through the specific mechanism of non-disclosure rather than through the honest engagement with what they knew that the disclosure would have required. The mechanism was the strategic silence. The strategic silence was the institution's primary management tool. The freeze was the strategic silence's specific failure, revealed in the moment of the management's inability to prevent the discovery from arriving at the person whose discovery the management had been organized to prevent. The subsequent years advanced the lesson through the specific accumulation of evidence that the daily experience of the marriage's private reality provided, the distance within the marriage, the specific quality of Charles's emotional availability organized around the primary connection outside the marriage, the institutional management's consistent choice of the public accounts requirements over Diana's welfare in every specific dimension where the two came into conflict. The specific pattern of an institution whose management of its members' private realities was organized around the institutional interest rather than around the members' interests, producing across the years of the management's operation the specific costs that the people inside the managed realities paid. Diana paid those costs, and the payment advanced the education. The eating disorder was the cost the early years imposed. The isolation was the cost the middle years imposed. The specific experience of being inside an institution whose management of her situation was organized around purposes she was not consulted about and interests that were not hers was the cost the full 15 years imposed in its accumulating form. The payment of each cost was also the accumulation of the specific raw material from which the education was building the capability that the frozen room had begun the building of. The capability was the strategic mind that the Panorama interview demonstrated. The demonstration was the demonstration of what the frozen room had set in motion across 14 years of the education's development, the specific ability to deploy the inside account in the public form, whose delivery the institutional management had organized itself across 15 years to prevent. Using the specific tools that the inside position made available and the specific strategic organization that the education had developed as the most effective method for the deployment's achievement. The deployment achieved what it achieved. The Panorama interview reached 23 million viewers and delivered the inside account with the authority of primary source testimony that the institutional management could not reduce to the level of the alternative account's credibility. The delivery produced the institutional crisis that the management had organized 15 years of sustained professional effort to prevent. The crisis produced the divorce. The divorce produced the post-divorce conditions. The post-divorce conditions contributed to the specific circumstances of Diana's death in August 1997. The frozen room also produced Camilla's public exposure. The Camillagate tapes publication in 1993 was the specific form of the public exposure, the release of the recorded conversation that documented the private reality of the relationship in the specific, undeniable terms of primary source evidence. The exposure was the product of the surveillance culture that the tabloid press of the relevant era had organized around the royal family's private communications, and the surveillance culture was the product of the specific press appetite that the management of the royal family's public account had always produced in the press world. The appetite for the private reality behind the managed public account, generated by the gap between the two and sustained by the management's consistent production of the gap. The exposure destroyed the alternative account's credibility in the specific dimensions that the Camillagate tape addressed. The alternative account had always depended, for its credibility, on the specific absence of primary source evidence that would prevent the accumulation of secondary evidence from being organized into the conclusive picture the alternative account was organized around preventing. The tape was primary source evidence. Its publication ended the alternative account's credibility in the specific dimensions of the telephone contact between Charles and Camilla, and the ending of the alternative account's credibility in those dimensions contributed to the broader erosion of the alternative account's overall credibility that the Morton book had begun and the Panorama interview would complete. The frozen room produced the rehabilitation. The specific conditions that the Wales marriage's history had created by the time of Diana's death in 1997 were the conditions that made the rehabilitation necessary. The conditions of a public whose understanding of the gap between the public account and the private reality had been substantially advanced by the inside accounts that the education's product had delivered, and whose capacity for the formal acknowledgement of the private reality that the rehabilitation was organized around producing required the specific management of the transition from the alternative account's dominance to the rehabilitation narrative's dominance that the 8 years between Diana's death and the 2005 wedding organized around. The rehabilitation produced the wedding. The wedding produced the formal acknowledgement of the private reality that the institutional management had organized 15 years of the Wales marriage's management to prevent from being formally acknowledged. The formal acknowledgement was the closing of the gap in the institutional sense, the production of a public account that acknowledged the private reality rather than managing it away from the public account's content. The gap's formal closing did not close the gap in the historical record. The historical record retains the gap as the foundational condition of the Wales marriage's history, retains the bracelet and the frozen room, and the 14 years of the education, and the Panorama interview, and the divorce, and the death, and the rehabilitation, and the wedding, as the chain that the frozen room set in motion on the day in July 1981, when Diana placed the discovered object on the table, and the people in the room understood what the placing communicated. The chain that runs from the frozen room to the queenship is the chain this account has examined across its preceding 9 sections, and the chain's examination produces the honest account of what the frozen room was the beginning of, the honest account of a specific object's discovery by a specific person in specific conditions, and of what the discovery and the conditions and the person combined to produce across the 44 years between the discovery and the accession that confirmed the queenship. The frozen room was the beginning. The beginning was organized around the institutional management's failure to prevent the discovery. The failure produced the education. The education produced the capability. The capability produced the Panorama interview. The Panorama interview produced the crisis. The crisis produced the divorce. The divorce produced the post-divorce conditions. The post-divorce conditions contributed to the death. The death produced the rehabilitation's necessity. The rehabilitation produced the wedding. The wedding produced the pathway to the queenship. The queenship was confirmed at the accession. The accession was the chain's current final link. The bracelet was the chain's first. The room that froze when Diana placed the bracelet on the table was the room in which the chain began. The people in the room who froze were the people who understood what the placing communicated about the management's failure and what the management's failure would produce. They were right to freeze. The management's failure produced everything this account has examined. The examination is complete. The chain continues. The specific institutional silence that surrounded the Charles and Camilla relationship across the full period from the engagement announcement in February 1981 through the Wales marriage's 15 years was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of knowledge managed, the specific organizational silence of an institution that had assessed what it knew, determined that the knowledge's disclosure would complicate the institutional interest in the public accounts maintenance, and organized itself around the non-disclosure with the professional consistency of an institution that had been managing sensitive private information about its senior members across the full length of the 20th century. The people who knew and said nothing were not a small or peripheral group. They were the people whose professional functions placed them closest to the private dimensions of the relevant situation. The private secretaries, the household officials, the protection officers, the courtiers, the press secretaries, and whose professional knowledge of the situation was the knowledge that the institutional management was organized around containing, rather than deploying, in the direction of the disclosure that the institutional interest in the management required to remain undone. Edward Adiane served as Charles's principal private secretary from 1979 to 1985, across the full critical period from before the engagement announcement through the first 4 years of the Wales marriage. Adiane was a man of the specific formation that the private secretary role in the royal household had always required. The old Etonian, the barrister, the man whose formation in the relevant institutions had produced the specific combination of discretion and professional intelligence that the private secretary to the Prince of Wales required in the conditions that the Wales marriage produced. He knew about the Charles and Camilla relationship. His professional function placed him in proximity to the private dimensions of Charles's life that the professional function required, and his knowledge of the relevant private reality was the knowledge of someone whose professional proximity to the situation made ignorance of its primary features not a credible account of his position. Adiane's management of the knowledge was the management of the institutional culture that his formation and his professional function had produced in him, the management of strategic silence, organized around the institutional interest in the public accounts maintenance, expressed through the specific non-disclosure that the culture required and that the culture enforced through the ambient social and professional pressure that the relevant world applied to people whose knowledge of sensitive institutional information was the knowledge the institution required to remain contained. He left Charles's private secretary role in 1985 in circumstances that the available accounts of the departure describe in terms that suggest a relationship between the departure and the specific difficulties of the Wales marriage's management, rather than simply the completion of a natural professional tenure. The departure's specific circumstances are not fully documented in the public record, but the accounts that address it are consistent in identifying the difficulties of the Wales marriage's management as a relevant context for understanding the timing and the terms of the departure. John Riddell succeeded Adiane and served as Charles's private secretary from 1985 to 1990, across the middle period of the Wales marriage when the difficulties were most acute and the management's challenges were most demanding. Riddell's management of the knowledge that his professional function gave him access to was the management of the institutional culture that his formation had produced in him and that the professional function required him to apply, the same strategic silence, organized around the same institutional interest, expressed through the same non-disclosure. The protection officers who accompanied Charles to the social occasions and the private meetings where the Camilla relationship was maintained across the marriage years were the people whose proximity to the physical dimensions of the situation gave them the most direct and the most specific knowledge of what the situation consisted of. The protection officer's function requires the sustained physical proximity to the protected person across the full range of their activities, the official engagements and the private ones, the public occasions and the ones organized around the private reality that the public account was not acknowledging. The protection officers who served Charles across the relevant period had the knowledge of people whose professional function had placed them in the specific physical proximity to the relevant activities that the specific knowledge of those activities required. Their management of the knowledge was the management that the relevant world's code of discretion required of them, as people whose professional function gave them access to the private dimensions of the relevant situation and whose professional survival within the institutional context depended on their management of that access through the specific silence that the culture enforced. The protection officers did not write memoirs about what they had seen. They did not provide the press with the specific information that their proximity to the relevant activities had made available to them. They maintained the silence that the relevant culture required, and the silence they maintained was the silence that sustained the management of the public account across the years, when the management was most vulnerable to the specific knowledge that their proximity had accumulated. The press secretaries occupy a specific position in the account of the people who knew and said nothing, because the press secretary's professional function was the most directly organized around the management of the gap between the public account and the private reality that the silence was sustaining. Michael Shea and Geoffrey Crawford, whose tenures as the Queen's press secretary across the relevant period placed them in the specific professional relationship with the management of the public account that the press secretary role required, had the institutional knowledge of the relevant private reality that their professional function's proximity. Their management of the knowledge was the management of professionals whose primary function was the maintenance of the public account in the face of the press's consistent appetite for the private reality that the public account was organized around not acknowledging. The management required the specific deployment of the strategic silence in the specific press contexts where the silence's maintenance was most directly challenged. The press inquiries about the specific dimensions of the private reality that the press appetite was organized around pursuing. The specific management of the press relationship in the direction of the public account's narrative, rather than the private reality's honest account. The management was professionally effective for the period during which the inside accounts deployment was not yet organized with the strategic capability that Diana's education was progressively developing. It became progressively less effective as the inside accounts deployment became more strategically organized and as the specific primary source evidence of the Camillagate tape and the Morton book reduced the management's available tools for the cultivation of the alternative account's credibility. Diana knew that people who knew had said nothing. The specific quality of her understanding of the institutional silence was the understanding that the Morton accounts and the Panorama interview communicated most directly. The understanding of someone who had been inside the management operation and who understood that the silence was not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of knowledge managed in the institutional interest rather than in her interest. The understanding was the most personally significant dimension of what the institutional silence had produced in Diana, because the understanding of the silence's character transformed the silence from a circumstantial failure into a specific institutional choice, whose implications for Diana's relationship to the institution were the implications of betrayal rather than oversight. She had not simply been unlucky in her discovery of the bracelet, she had been managed, specifically, deliberately, consistently managed, into the conditions of ignorance that the bracelet's discovery had interrupted, by an institution whose management of her information environment had been organized around the institutional interest rather than around the honest disclosure that her specific situation required. The understanding of the betrayal was the most significant product of the education the silence had organized. The people who had known and said nothing had, through their silence, provided the most important single lesson of the education, the lesson about what the institution was and what it would and would not do in the service of the people inside it. The lesson was the lesson about the institutional interest's consistent prioritization over the individual's interest, and the lesson was learned from the people who had known and said nothing, through the specific experience of being the person whose interest had been consistently subordinated to the interest that their silence was serving. They said nothing. The silence was the teaching. The teaching was the most significant dimension of the education. The education produced the capability. The capability deployed the inside account. The inside account produced the crisis. The crisis produced the divorce. The chain runs from the silence of the people who knew to every subsequent link in the chain that the silence set in motion. The people who knew and said nothing produced, through their silence, the most significant single institutional crisis of the modern British monarchy. The silence was the institution's choice. The choice produced the crisis. The crisis is still being managed. William and Harry grew up inside the gap between the Wales marriage's public account and its private reality, and the growing up inside the gap was the growing up whose specific conditions shaped both of them in the specific ways that the subsequent decades of their adult lives have expressed, with a consistency that the gap's conditions and the formation they produced make entirely legible. The gap was the foundational condition of the household they grew up in, established before either of them was born by the bracelet's discovery, and the conditions the discovery established as the marriage's organizing private reality. William was born in June 1982, 11 months after the wedding that the bracelet's discovery had preceded. Harry was born in September 1984. Both were born into the specific conditions of a household whose public account was the fairy tale account of the devoted royal couple, and whose private reality was the reality of a marriage organized around the gap between the public account and the private reality that the bracelet had first established as the marriage's foundational condition. The specific texture of growing up inside the gap was the texture that households organized around the gap between the managed surface and the private reality consistently produce in the children who grow up within them. The managed surface was maintained for the benefit of the public account's requirements. The public appearances of the devoted couple, the official photographs, the specific occasions organized around the fairy tale narratives sustaining. The private reality was the reality of the household's daily life, the distance within the marriage, the specific quality of the emotional environment that the distance produced, the particular texture of daily life in a household whose two primary adult figures were managing a relationship whose private reality and public account were organized around different facts. Children growing up in households organized around that specific gap develop the specific attunement to the gap's conditions that the conditions require for the navigation of the daily environment. The attunement is not a conscious strategy. It is the adaptive development of the specific perceptive capability that children in environments of managed surfaces and private realities develop through the daily practice of reading the actual texture of the environment, rather than the managed surface's account of it. Both William and Harry developed this capability across the years of their formation inside the Wales marriage's specific conditions, and the capability expressed itself in their adult lives in the specific different forms that their different personalities and positions within the family produced. Diana was present in the household as the parent who was most genuinely present in the specific sense of being actually available to the children in the moments of their daily life, rather than performing availability for the benefit of the relevant occasions. The school runs, the ordinary activities, the specific quality of maternal engagement that Diana had decided from the earliest period of her motherhood was the thing she was going to provide for her children, regardless of the institutional demands on the rest of her life. These were the specific forms of Diana's presence in the household, and the presence was the presence of someone who was genuinely organized around her children's experience of the daily life, rather than around the management of the public accounts requirements. Charles was present in the ways his formation and his schedule, and the specific conditions of the marriage's private reality allowed. The formation had not produced in him the specific quality of sustained intimate parental presence that Diana was providing, and the conditions of the marriage's private reality had not increased his available emotional resource for the sustained intimate parental engagement that the formation's limitations had already constrained. He was present at the required occasions. He provided genuine warmth in the specific moments his engagement was available for. The consistency of the intimate presence that Diana's parenting provided was not consistently available from Charles in the same sustained form. The household's specific emotional environment was the environment of two parents whose own relationship was organized around the gap's conditions, whose engagement with each other was the engagement of two people managing the institutional partnership in the specific conditions of a marriage whose primary emotional reality was located outside it, and whose children were growing up inside the specific atmospheric texture that those conditions produced in the household's daily life. William understood the atmosphere with the specific understanding of the eldest child, whose position within the family's structure had always placed him in the closest proximity to the adult dimensions of the family's institutional life. His formation across the years of the Wales marriage produced in him the specific capabilities and the specific constraints that the formation's conditions generated, the institutional awareness, the ability to manage the gap between the public account and the private reality in the specific way the family's institutional context required. The particular quality of someone whose formation had always included the awareness of the gap as the organizing condition of the household's daily life. Harry understood the atmosphere with the specific understanding of the younger child, whose position had given him slightly more distance from the most acute dimensions of the institutional management's demands, and slightly more latitude in the specific freedom from those demands that the younger child's position within the hierarchy allowed. The understanding produced different things in Harry than William's formation had produced in William: a more direct relationship with his own emotional experience, a lower tolerance for the managed surface's requirements, and eventually, the specific public willingness to name the gap and its conditions that the institutional management has found most consistently threatening in the contemporary period. Both brothers carry the gap's formation. They carry it in the specific forms that their different positions and personalities produced. William in the direction of institutional integration, Harry in the direction of the public accounting that the integration prevented. The directions are different. The source is the same. The source is the gap that the bracelet established as the foundational condition of the household they grew up in, and that the formation inside the household produced in both of them in the specific different ways that the same foundational condition produces different things in different people whose relationship to the condition is shaped by the different positions they occupied within it. Diana's death in August 1997 was the most acute dimension of the gap's production of consequences in the people most directly affected by the gap's conditions. William was 15, Harry was 12. The specific circumstances of the death, the post-divorce conditions, the specific vulnerability of the post-divorce public existence, the particular context of the pursuit that produced the Paris crash, were conditions that the gap's 15-year existence had contributed to producing, and the people who bore the most direct consequences of those conditions were the two boys who had grown up inside the gap and who were now, at 15 and 12, navigating the most acute consequence of its production. They navigated it inside the institutional environment, whose management of the public account of the death and its circumstances was the management of the same institutional culture that had managed the gap across the preceding 15 years. The management of the death's public account was the management of the gap's final major production, the management of the specific circumstances of Diana's death in the terms that the institutional interest required, rather than the terms that the honest engagement with those circumstances would have produced. William and Harry were inside the management. They had always been inside the management. They had grown up inside it, and it had shaped them in the specific ways this account has described and that their adult lives have expressed. The gap formed them. The formation is the gap's most enduring production. The gap was established by the bracelet. The bracelet was the beginning. The formation of two sons of the most watched marriage in the world is the bracelet's most enduring consequence. The bracelet revealed something about the institution that the institution has spent the subsequent decades managing the revelation of. The revelation was not the revelation of the Charles and Camilla relationship. That was the revelation the institutional management had been organized around preventing, and that the bracelet's discovery delivered to Diana in the specific conditions of the 11 days before the wedding. The deeper revelation was the revelation about the institution itself, about what the institution was, and what it was organized around, and what it would and would not do in the management of its own interests against the interests of the specific people its decisions most directly affected. The institution was revealed by the bracelet and by everything the bracelet set in motion as an institution whose primary organizing logic was the management of its own public account in the direction of the institutional interest rather than the honest engagement with the private realities that the public accounts management required to remain unacknowledged. This is not a novel revelation about powerful institutions in general. The prioritization of the institutional interest over the individual's interest is a feature of institutional management that the history of powerful institutions consistently documents. What is specific about the bracelet's revelation is the specific form that the prioritization took in the context of the Wales marriage, and the specific consequences the form's specific expression produced across the subsequent decades. The specific form was the non-disclosure of the Charles and Camilla relationship to Diana in the conditions of the engagement, the specific institutional choice to manage Diana into the marriage in the specific conditions of ignorance that the public accounts requirements made the institutional management prefer over the honest disclosure that the honest account of her situation required. The choice was made within the institutional framework that organized the relevant decisions, by the people whose professional functions placed them inside the decision-making process, in service of the institutional interest in the fairy tale narrative whose production the Wales marriage was contracted to provide. The choice was the institution at its most specific, not the institution in the abstract, not the institution as a category of powerful organizations that consistently prioritize their own interests over the individuals affected by their decisions, but the institution in the specific form of specific people making specific decisions, in specific conditions, in service of specific institutional interests, whose prioritization produced specific consequences for specific people. The specific people who paid the most direct consequences were Diana, who was managed into the marriage in the conditions of ignorance the bracelet's discovery interrupted, William and Harry, who grew up inside the gap the management produced, and Camilla, whose position in Charles's private life was managed into the status of the private reality the public account was organized around, not acknowledging across the full 15 years of the marriage's duration. The institution was revealed by the bracelet, and by everything the bracelet set in motion as an institution that was capable of the specific management the Wales marriage required of it, capable of organizing the non-disclosure, sustaining the management across 15 years of the marriage's duration, deploying the strategic silence across the full range of the management's challenges, and producing through the management the specific public account that the institutional interest required. The institution was also revealed as an institution whose management of its own interests, at the cost of the individuals most directly affected by those interests, was a management whose costs were eventually paid back to the institution in the specific form of the institutional crisis that the management had been organized to prevent. The crisis was Diana's deployment of the inside account, the specific deployment of the primary source testimony that the institutional management could not reduce to the alternative account's credibility, and the crisis's production was the inevitable consequence of the specific choice the management had made at the beginning, when the non-disclosure of the Charles and Camilla relationship to Diana had established the gap as the marriage's foundational condition. The gap was the institution's production. The gap produced the education produced the capability produced the crisis produced the consequences that the institution is still managing. The institution has never fully reckoned with the chain. The official account of the Wales marriage and its legacy is the account that the management culture has organized around the institutional interest rather than around the honest engagement with the chain and its implications. The rehabilitation of Camilla, the confirmation of the queenship, the specific management of Diana's legacy in the post-Diana period, all of these are the institutional management's continued production of the public account that the institutional interest requires, rather than the honest account that the chain's examination produces. The honest account is the account assembled here across the 13 sections of this script's examination. The account is honest in the specific sense that it is organized around the available evidence and its honest assessment, rather than around the institutional interest in the alternative account. The assessment is the assessment that the bracelet and everything it set in motion warrants, the assessment of a specific object's discovery and a specific institution's management of the reality the object communicated, and the specific consequences that the management's consistent prioritization of the institutional interest over the individual's interest produced across the 44 years between the discovery and the queenship. The bracelet revealed the institution. The institution managed the revelation across 44 years with the professional consistency of an institution that had been managing sensitive revelations across the full length of the 20th century. The management was effective in the specific sense of sustaining the public account's fairy tale narrative for a decade and producing the rehabilitation narrative that replaced it for the subsequent period. The management was ineffective in the specific sense of producing, through its consistent prioritization of the institutional interest, the specific educational conditions that gave Diana the capability to deploy the inside account in the form that the 23 million viewers of the Panorama interview received. The institution revealed by the bracelet was the institution that produced the most watched documentary marriage in the world, and the most watched divorce in the world, and the most watched death in the world, and the most watched rehabilitation in the world, and the most watched accession in recent memory. Every one of those productions was organized around the management of the gap that the bracelet established. Every one of them was the chain's link. The chain began with the bracelet. The bracelet revealed the institution. The institution is still being revealed. The revelation is still being managed. The management is still producing its costs. The costs are still being paid. The bracelet was small. The shadow it cast was not. The bracelet was found in July 1981. The woman who found it died in August 1997. The woman who received it became Queen Consort in September 2022. The institution that managed the knowledge of its existence across the intervening decades is the institution that the accession of Charles III formalized as the continuing fact of British constitutional life. 44 years separate the finding from the queenship, and the 44 years are the span across which everything the bracelet set in motion ran its course to the point the historical record has currently reached. The question of what the bracelet means now, in the specific contemporary context of the British monarchy navigating its post-Elizabeth II existence, with Charles III as king and Camilla as queen, with William and Harry having diverged in the specific public directions that their formation inside the Wales marriages gap produced in each of them, with the institutional management of the Wales marriages legacy still the active management of an institution that has never fully accounted for. The chain the bracelet began is the question that the honest examination of the available evidence is required to address rather than to manage into the comfortable framing that the institutional management's preferred narrative provides. The comfortable framing is the framing of resolution. The bracelet meant something in 1981, and the marriage it preceded meant something across its 15 years, and the death that followed the marriage's end meant something in 1997, and then the rehabilitation and the wedding meant something, and the accession meant something, and the queenship means something, and the meaning of each subsequent development in the chain is the meaning of a resolution whose progressive stages have produced the final outcome that the chain's examination reveals as its endpoint. The comfortable framing says, Charles and Camilla found each other. The institution managed the finding across the decades of the management's requirements. The management eventually produced the formal acknowledgement. The formal acknowledgement produced the marriage produced the queenship, and the queenship is the resolution. The comfortable framing is the institutional management's preferred narrative. It organizes the chain around the love story and the institutional obstacles and the eventual triumph of the genuine connection over the obstacles, and the organization produces the account of the Wales marriage and its legacy as a story whose endpoint is the appropriate resolution of a genuine love's institutional complications, rather than as a story whose endpoint is the product of a specific set of institutional choices whose costs were paid by specific people across specific decades, and whose honest accounting the institution has consistently declined to produce. The honest examination produces a different account of what the bracelet means now. The honest account acknowledges the genuine love story. The connection between Charles and Camilla was real, and its 50-year duration is the most significant available evidence of its genuine quality, without organizing the full account around the love story in the way that the institutional management's preferred narrative has always organized it. The full account includes the love story and the institutional management, and the specific costs the management imposed on the specific people who bore those costs. And the honest account of what the bracelet means now is the honest account of all three dimensions of the full account and their relationship to each other. The love story dimension is the dimension the official account has always had most access to, because the love story is the dimension that the institutional management's preferred narrative is organized around, and that the available evidence most directly supports in the specific sense of documenting the genuine connection across 50 years of its sustained maintenance in conditions that consistently complicated the maintenance. Charles and Camilla found something genuinely valuable in each other in 1970. And maintained it across the 50 years that followed through the institutional obstacles and the personal costs and the specific management requirements of the relevant social world's code of discretion, and the maintenance across those conditions is the most significant evidence of the genuine quality of what was being maintained. The queenship is the love story's formal resolution, and the formal resolution is genuinely that. The formal acknowledgement of a private reality that the institution managed away from the public account for 34 years, and that the public account eventually incorporated in the specific terms that the rehabilitation operation organized the preceding 8 years to produce. Camilla is queen consort. The acknowledgement is complete. The love story's formal resolution is the most complete resolution available within the institutional framework that the relevant circumstances produced. The institutional management dimension is the dimension the official account has always had least access to, because the institutional management's preferred narrative is organized around the love story and the institutional obstacles, rather than around the honest examination of the specific decisions the institutional management made and the specific costs those decisions imposed on the people most directly affected by them. The institutional management's decisions were the decisions this account has examined across its preceding 13 sections. The non-disclosure of the Charles and Camilla relationship to Diana in the conditions of the engagement, the sustained management of the public account through the strategic silence across 15 years of the Wales marriage, the specific management of Diana's position in the post-separation and post-divorce period, the rehabilitation operations organization of the public account's transition from the alternative narrative to the acknowledgement narrative across the 8 years between Diana's death and the 2005 wedding. Each of these decisions was made within the institutional framework that organized the relevant choices around the institutional interest rather than around the individual's interest, and each produced specific costs for specific people, whose bearing of those costs the institutional management's preferred narrative has always organized around the minimum available acknowledgement. The minimum available acknowledgement is the acknowledgement that Diana suffered within the marriage, that the marriage's difficulties were real, that the specific quality of the institutional management's response to those difficulties was not always adequate to what the situation required. The minimum acknowledgement stops well short of the honest accounting of the chain the bracelet began and the specific institutional decisions that produce the chain's specific links. The honest accounting would require the institution to acknowledge specifically that the non-disclosure of the Charles and Camilla relationship to Diana in the conditions of the engagement was an institutional choice that served the institutional interest at the direct cost of Diana's ability to make an informed decision about the marriage she was entering. The honest accounting would require the acknowledgement that the management of the public account across 15 years of the Wales marriage was organized around the institutional interest rather than around Diana's welfare in every specific dimension where the two came into conflict. The honest accounting would require the acknowledgement that the specific conditions of Diana's post-divorce existence were conditions the institutional management had contributed to producing through the specific form the divorce's management took, and that those conditions contributed to the specific vulnerability of the post-divorce public existence in which the Paris crash occurred. The institution has not produced the honest accounting. The institutional management's preferred narrative has produced the minimum available acknowledgement and organized itself around the love story's resolution rather than around the honest engagement with the chain the management's decisions produced. The organization serves the institutional interest in the post-Diana management of the Wales marriage's legacy. The interest is the interest of an institution that requires the public's continued willingness to extend it the deference that the institutional legitimacy depends on, and whose assessment of that public's tolerance for the honest accounting of the management's costs has consistently concluded that the minimum acknowledgement is the maximum the management can provide without exceeding the tolerance. The costs dimension is the dimension whose honest accounting the institution most consistently avoids and whose acknowledgement is most overdue. The costs were paid by Diana, by William and Harry, by Camilla, and by Charles himself, by each in different forms and to different degrees, but by each in the specific way that the gap the bracelet established as the foundational condition of the Wales marriage produced costs for the people who were inside the gap across its 15-year existence and in the conditions that the gap's existence created for the subsequent management of its legacy. Diana paid the most acute and the most publicly documented of the costs: the eating disorder, the isolation, the specific quality of the institutional management's consistent prioritization of the public accounts requirements over her welfare, the Panorama interview as the education's product deployed in the institutional crisis the management had organized 15 years to prevent, the divorce in the specific terms that the institutional management's assessment of its interests required, the death in the specific conditions of the post-divorce existence. The costs were real and the bearing of them was real, and the institutional management's contribution to the conditions that produced them was real, and the honest account of the bracelet's meaning now requires the honest acknowledgement of all of it. William and Harry paid the costs that growing up inside the gap's conditions produced in each of them. The formation inside the household whose public account and private reality were organized around different facts, the specific adolescent experience of the most acute production of the gap's consequences in the form of Diana's death at 36, the subsequent navigation of the institutional management's continued application of the management culture's primary tools to the management of their own positions within the institution they had been born into. William's version of the cost is the version of institutional integration whose price is the specific constraints of the heir's position and the management culture's continued shaping of the available space within those constraints. Harry's version is the version of institutional distancing whose price has been the specific public consequences of the most direct available account of the management culture's operation from someone who has been inside it for the full span of their formation. Camilla paid the costs of the specific position she occupied across the 15 years of the Wales marriage, the position of the primary private reality whose existence the public account was organized around not acknowledging, managed through the relevant world's code of discretion in the specific conditions that the management required, and that the management's failure produced in the most acute form in the Camillagate tapes publication. The public hostility that the tapes publication generated was real and sustained and organized around Camilla as the primary available target for the public response to the gap's revelation, and the bearing of that hostility across the subsequent years of the rehabilitation's development was the cost of the position the institutional management had organized around her existence in Charles's private life. Charles paid the costs that the specific form of the institutional management's organization of his private life's relationship to the public account imposed across the full span of the Wales marriage and its aftermath. The costs were the costs of someone whose primary emotional connection was required to remain the private reality rather than the acknowledged reality across 34 years between the Wales wedding and the 2005 wedding, the specific costs of managing the maintenance of the primary connection in the conditions that the management required, of living inside the gap between the public account and the private reality in the specific position of the gap's primary producer rather than its primary victim. What the bracelet means now, in the specific contemporary context of the British monarchy's navigation of its post-Elizabeth II existence, is what the honest account of everything it set in motion produces as its meaning, the meaning of a specific object that revealed a specific institution's specific management of a specific private reality across a specific span of time, and that the chain the revelation set in motion produced specific consequences for specific people across the full span of the 44 years between the finding and the queenship. The meaning is not the comfortable meaning of the love story's resolution. The love story's resolution is real, and the genuine connection's formal acknowledgement is genuine, and the queenship is the appropriate endpoint of a private reality's institutional acknowledgement that was long overdue. All of this is true, and all of it is part of the meaning. The meaning also includes the management and the costs and the chain and the honest accounting of all three, that the institutional management's preferred narrative has always organized around the minimum available acknowledgement rather than the full honest engagement. The full honest engagement is what the bracelet's meaning now requires, the acknowledgement that the object discovered in Buckingham Palace in July 1981 was the beginning of a chain whose links were the specific institutional decisions and their specific costs, and the specific people who bore those costs across the 44 years that the chain ran. Diana found the bracelet. The finding changed everything. The bracelet preceded. The changing produced the Wales marriage in the specific conditions the bracelet established. The conditions produced the education produced the capability produced the crisis produced the divorce produced the death's conditions, the death produced the rehabilitation's necessity, the rehabilitation produced the wedding produced the pathway to the accession confirmed the queenship. The queenship is where the chain has reached. The chain began with a gold bracelet with a blue enamel disc bearing 2 letters found by a 20-year-old woman in Buckingham Palace 11 days before her wedding. The woman who found it is gone. The institution that managed the knowledge of its existence across 44 years is still here, still managing, still organized around the institutional interest in the public accounts maintenance, rather than around the honest accounting of what the management across 44 years produced and who paid for what it produced. The honest accounting is what the bracelet means now. The honest accounting is this account. The account is complete. The chain continues. The management continues. The costs continue to be paid by the people the management produces them in. The bracelet is gone. What it set in motion is not. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.